Oh, it seems I have a visitor this evening. Welcome. The night sky hangs clear and cold tonight, the aurora dancing green above the peaks, and I know you've come to rest beneath it. Take things slowly, and all will be well. I have some tales to share, ones that you may like. Tonight we go back further than any Nord, further than any king or dragon, back to when there was no time at all, when gods still walked upon the world, and when the elves ruled the land under an empty sky. Are you all settled for this night? Good. Then let us begin at the very beginning, in the age before dawn. Before there was a world, before there was a sky to hold the stars, or a ground to catch the rain, there was only the great nothingness that the old scholars call the chaos. It stretched on without shape, without edge, and without meaning, a churning expanse where nothing held its form for longer than a moment. The Aldmer named this the pre-creation, the emptiness that came before all things that can be counted or named. And within that emptiness, though the word barely fits, two forces rose and stirred. The scholars who write of such matters give them names, and those names are Anu and Padome. Anu was the force of stasis, the impulse toward order, toward light, toward the kind of stillness in which a thing can rest and remain what it is. Padome was the opposite pull, the force of change and chaos and darkness, the drive that unmakes and reshapes and never lets a thing stay settled. The two of them existed within the great void, and for a long span that had no measure, they simply were. Yet as they drifted through the emptiness, their paths crossed, and where the two forces met, something entirely new began to take shape. That meeting of order and chaos gave rise to what the wise call the Arbis, the grey middle that lies between pure light and pure dark. The Arbis was the totality of all that could exist, the whole of creation in its earliest and most turbulent form. In those first moments it churned and shifted, an unstable swirl where light and shadow bled into one another and nothing yet held a lasting form. From this restless brew, the first true shapes would eventually rise, though that part of the tale comes shortly. For now, understand only that the Arbis was the cradle, the vast grey space in which everything that would ever come to be was still nothing more than possibility. Now, you should know this, traveller. What I tell you is myth, and myth wears many faces. The Nords who share my hearth tell this beginning one way. The high elves of the Somerset Isles tell it another, and the men of Cyrodiil in yet a third. Some speak of Anu and his brother Padome as two forces locked in eternal struggle. Others call them Anuiel and Sithis, or by names older still. Each people carries its own version, coloured by what they revere and what they fear, and no single telling holds the whole truth. Yet beneath all the differences, the same shape appears again and again. There is order and there is chaos, and from the meeting of the two, the world was born. That is the route that every telling shares, and it is the route we will follow tonight. Say, consider the scale of it for a moment, as you rest there by the fire. There was no time yet, for time itself had not been born. There was no direction, no up or down, no here or there. There was only the grey churn of the Aubis, holding within it the seed of everything. The gods who would shape the world, and the gods who would refuse to. The elves and the men, the mountains and the seas, the very laws that would one day hold the ground beneath your boots in place. All of it waited, unformed, in that first grey expanse. And within that expanse, the swirling of order and chaos did not remain empty for long. As the two great forces mingled again and again, Their interplay began to draw the grey stuff of the Arbis into distinct and separate shapes. These were the first beings, the earliest spirits to rise out of creation, and they would come to be called the original spirits. From them would spring the gods that men and elves would kneel before for all the ages to come. It is with their birth that our tale takes its next step, and it is there that the true actors of this long story first open their eyes. The grey expanse of the Aurbis shifted as the opposing forces of stasis and chaos collided. Waves of searing white light smashed into walls of thick, heavy darkness. Where these currents struck one another, the frictions sparked and boiled, throwing off fragments of raw energy. These fragments cooled and coalesced in the grey void, taking on distinct forms and solidifying into massive, crystalline structures alongside spiraling clouds of glowing dust. These formed the Etada, the original spirits. They drifted through the churning expanse as giant orbs of luminescence, towering pillars of frost, and writhing masses of shadow. Each spirit possessed a physical weight and a distinct resonance that echoed through the Arbis, shaking the raw matter around them. During these violent collisions, the raw essence of the two great forces spilled out into the void. The old texts describe this spilling as blood. Rivulets of blinding, white-hot liquid poured from the force of stasis, scattering across the dark backdrop. These burning drops crystallized into brilliant fixed points of light, forming the stars that blanketed the upper reaches of the void. From the force of chaos, a thick, viscous black sludge bled outward, pooling into dense, shifting masses that absorbed the surrounding light. The spirits born entirely from this dark, chaotic blood adopted its volatile properties, growing jagged, ever-changing forms, with limbs of hooked bone and eyes like burning coals. The scholars call these spirits the Daedra, beings composed solely of the dark fluid, who carved out jagged realms of their own and shaped the void into shifting landscapes of fire and shadow. Other spirits formed where the two bloods mixed. The bright burning liquid of order swirled together with the thick black fluid of chaos, fusing into a marbled stream of energy. The resulting mixture ran through the veins of a new group of spirits, giving them a dual physical composition. They radiated the brilliant light of stasis, yet their forms shifted and cracked with the volatile energy of chaos. These spirits, born of the mingled blood, are the Aedra, the beings who would one day be known as the ancestors. They possess the physical strength to build structures of perfect symmetry out of the void's dust, and they carry the sheer destructive force to crush those same structures with their bare hands. The blinding heat of creation burns in their chests, alongside the cold, crushing weight of destruction. The constant collisions within the Arbis kept the expanse boiling with kinetic force, as blinding flashes of light and deafening shockwaves ripped through the grey space, scattering the newly formed spirits. Then, the greatest of the original spirits formed from the pure light of Anu. This was Auriel. His body took the shape of a towering golden figure clad in plates of shimmering light, and he carried a heavy, metallic bow. As Auriel stepped through the turbulent expanse, the violent shockwaves slowed to a gentle hum. The boiling pockets of energy settled into calm, glowing pools, and the jagged shards of raw matter smoothed into spheres of polished glass. The heavy darkness retreated from his golden aura, leaving wide, stable regions within the Aubis where the other spirits could gather and walk, avoiding the crushing pressure of the constant storms. Upon Auriel's arrival, a new physical property rippled through the Arbis. A steady, Rhythmic pulse began to vibrate through the grey dust, laying out a physical path through the void. A spirit could step from one glowing pool to another, and the movement left a distinct, observable trail of stardust behind them. Energy flowed in a single direction, cause created an observable effect, and actions remained permanent in a continuous line once completed. This steady, forward-moving pulse became time itself. Under the continuous pulse of time, the spirits settled into consistent, enduring forms, gaining the physical stability to interact with one another. The swirling clouds of dust condensed into humanoid figures with long limbs and glowing skin, while the writhing shadows grew thick arms, digitigrade legs, and horned heads. Because events now happened in a sequence, the spirits observed their own reflections in the smooth surfaces of the crystalline structures and mapped the boundaries of their physical forms, noting where their glowing skin ended and the grey void began. Recognizing their distinct shapes, they claimed names. They carved these names into the floating rocks with glowing fingertips and sang them out into the echoing expanse. Throats formed, vocal cords vibrated, and the sound of their names established their permanent identities within the newly ordered sequence of time. As the spirits settled into their identities and mapped their territories within the Arbis, they observed new variations among themselves. While Ariel radiated golden light and brought stillness to the regions he walked, another spirit gathered form in the deeper shadows of the void. This spirit formed from the thick, viscous fluid of chaos, yet he moved through the stabilized regions with a calculated, deliberate stride. He possessed a body composed of dark, shifting ash, and his chest held a massive, beating core that pulsed in a contrasting rhythm to the rest of the Arbis. His voice carried a low, rumbling frequency that vibrated through the crystalline structures, catching the attention of the others. He observed the Aedra as they built their glowing spheres, and he watched the Daedra as they carved out jagged pockets of darkness. With a slow, sweeping motion of his ash-covered arms, he gathered the other spirits, bringing them close to hear his words and listen to a proposal that would alter the fabric of the Orbis forever. The ash-covered spirit stood before the gathered crowd, his broad chest expanding and contracting around the deep, rhythmic thud of his core. The others called him Lorcan. He grew directly from the thick black sludge of chaos, carrying the heavy, solid properties of his dark origin. Where the golden Oriel brought expansive light that filled the grey spaces, Lorcan functioned as a dense physical boundary. Radiant light struck his ashen skin and stopped immediately upon impact. Kinetic energy waves hit his broad shoulders and scattered into dull sparks across the floor. He operated as a wall within the Arbis, a solid limit that forced the surrounding spirits to recognize hard edges and rigid containment. He stood in the exact center of a glowing crystalline amphitheater, his dark, opaque form stark against the brilliant white stones beneath his feet. Lorcan raised his thick arms, and the low rumble of his voice rattled the polished stones under the spirits. He opened his hands and gathered a swirling mass of grey dust, compressing it tightly between his dark palms. The friction of the grinding dust ignited a small, glowing ember in the center of the mass. Around this central ember, he arranged thick bands of heavier rock and flowing streams of liquid energy. He held up the rotating model for the crowd to observe closely. He called this construct Mundus, a confined system of intersecting spheres, featuring a dense, rocky center he named Nirn. Compared to the endless, shifting expanse of the wider Arbis, this model possessed hard, impenetrable borders. The rocks within it followed strict, repetitive, circular paths, and the energy moved at a set, unyielding pace. Lorcan presented a world governed by strict physical limits and heavy gravity. As Lorcan rotated the model for the crowd, the outer edges of the dust sphere began to fray and drift apart. The dark sludge of his own chaotic blood possessed a volatile, scattering property, causing the compacted dust to crumble. The heavy rocks broke their orbits, and the liquid energy boiled off into the void as a thin vapor. Lorcan lowered his hands and extended his thick fingers toward the golden-skinned spirits in the front rows. He demonstrated that his own physical mass could only provide the outer boundary, the empty container for this new world. To make the rocks solid, to make the energy flow continuously in a closed loop, and to keep the structure from collapsing into dust, he required the stabilizing light of the other spirits. He asked them to step forward, open their chests, and pour their own burning, bright essence directly into the center of the construct. He asked them to become the structural foundation of Mundus. The gathered Etadar observed the crumbling dust in Lorcan's palms and calculated the physical toll of his request. Pouring their essence into the construct required a permanent transfer of mass and heat. Injecting their glowing energy into the rock to make it solid meant their own bodies would dim, their towering forms would shrink, their skin would cool, and the vast kinetic power they wielded across the abyss would drain away into the dirt and water of Nirn. They faced a permanent physical exchange. They could retain their massive, towering forms and endless heat, or they could shrink into lesser shapes to solidify a new, contained world. The golden figure of Oriel stood at the front, his bright eyes fixed on the rotating dust. Next to him, other glowing figures leaned forward, extending their hands toward the model. The prospect of shaping a completely new structure, one with permanent, unbreakable rules, drew them in. They watched the small ember in Lorcan's hands and envisioned constructing massive mountains of solid granite, deep trenches filled with heavy saltwater, and thick forests of fibrous wood. The creation of such dense, heavy matter required a massive input of their light. These spirits nodded, their glowing hair flaring brighter as they accepted the transfer. They prepared to carve out pieces of their own chests and bleed their stasis energy into the dust to forge the new realm. Behind them, the spirits composed entirely of the dark, viscous fluid reacted differently. They shifted their weight on their digitigrade legs, their horned heads tilting back away from the light. These beings relished the massive, unchecked power they held in the open expanse of the void. They looked at the confined, rigid borders of Mundus and bared their sharp teeth. The thought of trapping their volatile, ever-changing energy inside fixed rocks and predictable water currents drove them backward. They crossed their jagged arms over their chests, shielding their dark cores from Lorcan's gaze. They chose to retain their massive height, their high heat, and their unbound limbs, stepping entirely away from the heavy mechanics of the dirt sphere. Lorcan watched the crowd fracture in real time. He kept his hands outstretched, the crumbling model of Mundus still rotating between his dark palms as the physical separation of the crowd cemented the future architecture of the universe. To the left, the spirits of mixed blood stepped forward, their glowing auras bleeding together as they prepared to shed their power. To the right, the jagged, shadowed spirits stepped backward, their forms bristling with retained kinetic energy as they accepted a different path. The ground between the two groups split, a deep fissure cracking through the white crystalline stones of the gathering place. The dividing line was drawn in the rock itself, separating those who would build from those who would depart. The jagged spirits turned their horned heads away from the light, bending their knees to launch themselves back into the deep, formless stretches of the void to claim their own territories. The jagged spirits moved backward into the deep expanse, pulling their dense, volatile mass away from the rotating sphere of dust in Lorcan's hands. As they retreated into the dark outer edges of the orbis, they retained their massive height and their burning, chaotic heat. The elves of later eras call these departing beings the Daedra, the distant outsiders. They kept their energy locked within their own chests. Using their long, hooked claws, they tore into the black fluid of the surrounding void, physically pulling the raw matter apart to carve out isolated pockets of space. Within these hollowed-out pockets, they constructed their own sprawling domains. One spirit dragged its claws together to ignite vast, churning seas of green fire, while another compressed the dark matter into towering, jagged spires of black iron. A third spun the chaos into winding labyrinths of thick, sticky silk. Because the Daedra kept their internal power, their bodies remained fluid and unbound. They shifted rapidly from horned beasts with cloven hooves to multi-armed, armored giants in a constant shower of kinetic sparks. They populated their newly carved realms with smaller replicas of themselves, lesser creatures molded from their own dark sludge, entirely separate from the heavy dirt of Mundus. These realms float in the vast, cold space known as Oblivion, a thick, turbulent barrier of raw chaos surrounding the new world. The air in these realms smells of boiling sulfur, copper blood, and electric ozone, reacting violently to the massive spirits who rule them. Back at the center of the crystalline amphitheater, the glowing spirits of mixed blood stepped closer to the physical model. The later scholars named this group the Aedra, the ancestors. They pressed their bright, luminescent hands against the crumbling dust of Lorcan's sphere. The transfer of mass began immediately. Searing white light flowed down their arms, pouring directly into the grey dirt and fusing the loose particles into dense, solid rock. As the light drained from their chests, the physical cost manifested clearly on their bodies. Their towering, golden forms shrank. The bright, radiating heat of their skin cooled to a dull, faint shimmer, and rough patches of calcified crust formed over their shoulders and arms. Their long limbs grew heavy, their joints stiffening as their movements slowed. They traded their unbound kinetic energy for the permanence of heavy stone, thick water, and rigid laws of physics. The physical contrast between the two groups hardened into observable reality. The Daedra, in their distant pockets of oblivion, roared with limitless heat, expanding their massive forms at will and throwing off shockwaves that rattled the dark void. The Aedra stood around Mundus, their backs bowed, their glowing feet sinking into the heavy, hardening stone they created. Their glowing eyes dulled to a pale yellow, and their voices dropped from deafening thunder to low, labored exhalations. They poured their own blood into the soil, watching the rock turn from grey to rich brown as it absorbed their vitality. The more stable and solid the new world became, the more the bodies of the Aedra degraded, chilling to the temperature of the dirt beneath them. Among the labouring Aedra stood a towering spirit named Magnus. He possessed a dense blue-white core that radiated a piercing, concentrated light, cutting through the swirling dust of the construction site. Magnus functioned as the chief architect of the sphere. He held a massive, unrolled scroll composed of glowing geometric lines, intersecting angles, and hovering numerical runic symbols. He carried large calipers forged from starlight, using them to measure the exact curvature of the planetary crust and the precise depth required for the ocean trenches. He directed the other spirits with sharp, deliberate hand gestures, pointing his thick fingers at unstable fault lines, collapsing caverns, and areas of crumbling dust. Where Magnus pointed, The Aedra pressed their hands, injecting their light to seal the cracks and bind the heavy elements together with massive deposits of iron and lead. Magnus dictated the rigid physical laws of the construct. He drew precise, overlapping circles on his glowing scroll, and the heavy rocks inside Mundus locked into corresponding orbital paths around the center. He traced thick downward lines with his fingers, and a strong, pulling gravity clamped down on the surface of Nirn, holding the loose dirt and pooling water firmly in place. He established the freezing point of ice and the melting point of magma, yelling out the exact thermodynamic limits in a sharp, ringing tone that echoed across the forming crust. The Aedra followed his blueprints, adjusting their energy output to match his complex, rigid calculations. Magnus observed the growing density of the world, constantly adjusting his geometric lines as the dirt absorbed the golden light. The structure of Nirn grew massive, its surface covered in jagged, bare rock ridges and deep, empty basins waiting for the rains. The air above the surface hung thick with displaced dust, smelling of crushed minerals and heated granite. The Aedra knelt in the newly formed dirt, their hands submerged wrist-deep in the cooling stone, pushing their final reserves of heat downward into the churning planetary core. Magnus rolled up his glowing scroll, securing it tightly beneath his heavy arm. He raised his hand, signaling for the heaviest, most grueling phase of the construction to commence. The spirits shifted their weight, planting their knees firmly into the solidifying ground, preparing to physically tear and shape the jagged crust into the mountains and valleys of the mortal plane. The glowing spirits drove their arms into the newly solidified crust of Nirn. Thick clouds of mineral dust and steam billowed upward as their high-temperature hands sank into the cooling stone. They dragged their fingers through the heavy basalt, carving out deep, jagged trenches to hold the pooling salt water. They pushed massive slabs of granite against each other, forcing the rock upward to form towering mountain ranges. With every movement, the heavy gravity of the sphere pulled at their shoulders, demanding immense physical exertion to lift the materials. As they worked, the brilliant white light from their chests flowed down their arms and seeped directly into the soil. They compressed loose carbon into dense diamonds, packed heavy metals into the deep planetary mantle, and exhaled swirling currents of atmospheric gases into the empty sky. The physical toll of the transfer accelerated rapidly. The blinding luminescence of their skin faded to a dull, flickering orange. The smooth, crystalline texture of their limbs fractured, developing deep fissures that leaked a pale, sluggish fluid. Their towering spines curved under the crushing atmospheric pressure of the new world. Many of the spirits dropped to their hands and knees, their legs buckling under their own rapidly increasing weight. The cold of the dirt seeped back up their arms, chilling their core temperatures. They inhaled the thick, sulphurous air, their newly formed lungs straining to extract energy from an environment composed entirely of dense, inert matter. Their voices dropped from resonant, booming chords to low, grinding rasps as they communicated their physical distress to one another. The structure of Nirn consumed their light at a voracious rate. The dirt and rock possessed the volatile, degrading properties of the chaotic sludge. When the spirits shaped a smooth valley, the edges immediately began to erode. Heavy rains washed the topsoil away, exposing jagged bedrock. The wind carried abrasive sand that scoured the surface of the stones. To maintain the shapes they built, the Aedra poured continuous streams of heat into the ground. The world functioned as a massive engine of decay. The raw matter required a constant influx of power, simply to resist crumbling back into loose ash. Freshly compressed metals began to flake with red rust within moments of their creation. Pockets of heated water quickly grew stagnant and thick with foul-smelling algae. The Aedra recognized the foundational building blocks of this sphere as the chaotic essence. The texts identify this highly entropic environment as the House of Sithis. Several of the laboring spirits exhausted their internal reserves completely, their dull orange glow extinguished, leaving their skin the color of dried clay. Their knees locked into the dirt, their arms calcified, fusing permanently with the granite boulders they held. The fluid in their veins thickened and cooled, turning into veins of solid silver and iron beneath the crust. Their eyes hardened into unblinking gemstones. The cessation of movement and the total loss of heat introduced a new physical state to the Aobis. The remaining spirits observed these stationary forms and identified the mechanics of mortality. A spirit expended its entire mass, lost all kinetic potential, and became a fixed, permanent fixture of the landscape. They watched their brethren dissolve into raw environmental mechanics, becoming the howling wind, the freezing frost, and the pulling gravity. The surviving Aedra examined their own cracked hands and the frozen bodies of their kin. They looked at the heavy, eroding mountains and the dark, thick oceans. They traced the energy flow, watching their light disappear into the dirt. They evaluated the physical dimensions of Lorcan's construct and the resulting degradation of their own mass. The exchange demanded their complete dissolution. They calculated the mass of Nirn and compared it to their own dwindling reserves. The calculations displayed a deliberate imbalance. The creation of Mundus required the absolute consumption of their bodies. Magnus stood among the jagged mountain peaks, his blue-white core now flickering and dimming to a pale grey. He held up his starlight calipers, measuring the remaining heat in his own chest against the massive energy deficit of the planetary crust. The mathematical runic symbols on his unrolled scroll shifted rapidly, tallying the exact volume of light drained into the soil. The final calculation appeared on the parchment, indicating a total cessation of his light within the next sequence of physical movements. He looked at the deep fault lines in the rock and the bodies of the petrified spirits surrounding him. He dropped his heavy tools onto the rocky ground. The metal calipers shattered against the basalt, sending sharp fragments of starlight scattering across the dirt. Magnus turned his head away from the heavy soil, locking his gaze on the dark, chaotic boundary separating Mundus from the vast, open Aetherius above. Magnus braced his heavy, glowing feet against the cracked basalt of the planetary crust. He bent his knees, gathering the remaining blue-white energy within his core, and drove his immense kinetic force downward into the rock. The ground shattered under the impact, sending massive boulders and thick clouds of pulverized granite flying into the air. A deafening shockwave ripped across the newly formed valleys, knocking the surrounding spirits into the wet dirt. Magnus launched his massive form upward, accelerating away from the center of Mundus. He pushed through the thick, heavy atmospheric gases, his body generating intense heat and friction as he broke the gravitational pull he had just finished calculating. He streaked through the dark, empty space above Nirn, heading directly for the thick, chaotic barrier of oblivion that enclosed the new world. The outer boundary consisted of dense, viscous black matter, a thick shell of chaos, separating Mundus from the infinite expanse beyond. Magnus struck this dark barrier with the full momentum of his ascent. The collision produced a blinding flash and a concussive boom that vibrated back down to the planetary core. Magnus drove his thick fingers into the black sludge, pulling his arms apart with massive physical exertion. He tore a gaping, ragged hole straight through the fabric of the container. Through this massive puncture, he pulled his body out of the heavy, decaying system of Mundus and disappeared into the expanse beyond. The dark matter of the barrier failed to close behind him, leaving the edges of the tear to burn and fray. This massive, jagged hole remained fixed in the sky, becoming the brilliant, blinding focal point the inhabitants of the world would later identify as the sun. Observing the chief architect's violent exit, a vast multitude of lesser glowing spirits abandoned their work in the dirt. They dropped their loads of packed iron and wet clay, bending their knees to follow his upward trajectory. They launched themselves from the crust in a dense swarm, streaking through the heavy atmosphere like a reverse cascade of glowing embers. These spirits hit the dark boundary of oblivion moments after Magnus. Possessing a fraction of his mass, they punched thousands of tiny individual holes through the black matter as they escaped the decaying world. The jagged barrier remained dotted with these small punctures, scattering across the dark curvature of the sky. The sharp pinpricks of light, bleeding through the dark canopy, formed the stars, mapping the exact exit routes of the fleeing spirits. Beyond the punctured barrier lay Aetherius, an endless region of pure, blinding white light and limitless kinetic energy. It contained no heavy dirt, no eroding wind, and no cooling temperatures, holding only absolute stasis and radiant heat. Through the massive tear left by Magnus, and through the thousands of smaller holes punched by his followers, the raw, high-heat fluid of Aetherius began to leak back into Mundus. The light poured down from the massive central hole, striking the surface of Nirn and heating the cold, graying rocks. This raw energy flowed through the atmosphere as a volatile, vibrating substance. When it made contact with the heavy elements of Nirn, it caused erratic physical reactions. Solid boulders hovered above the soil, pockets of salt water ignited into bright blue flames, and the atmospheric gases crystallized into humming glass. This unfiltered leaking energy flowing from the holes in the sky formed the physical substance known as magic, introducing unpredictable variables into the rigid thermodynamic laws previously established. Back on the surface, the remaining heavy spirits stood knee-deep in the cooling mud. The bright light from Aetherius washed over their graying skin and calcified arms, illuminating the deep fissures forming across their torsos. The physical crust of Nirn groaned under their feet. The heavy granite mountains began to slide downward, the rock grinding against rock as the fault lines shifted. The saltwater oceans seeped into wide, unstable cracks in the basalt floor. The entire physical structure of the world started to disintegrate into loose gravel and escaping steam, destabilized by the sudden absence of the chief architect and the massive loss of internal heat. The remaining spirits planted their heavy feet into the sliding dirt, locking their stiff joints against the tremors. To prevent the massive boulders from crumbling into dust and the atmospheric gases from boiling off into the void, a group of these spirits stepped toward the widening fault lines, preparing to cast their bodies directly into the grinding tectonic plates and fuse their own spines into the physical laws required to hold the dirt together. The massive fault lines cracked wider, exposing the churning molten rock beneath the crust. A group of the dull, graying spirits stepped forward to the edges of these deep fissures. They watched the bright light of Aetherius leak through the ragged holes in the sky, observing the upward trajectory of their fleeing kin. They planted their heavy feet firmly into the sliding basalt. They drove their stiffening hands deep into the boiling magma of the planetary mantle, pushing their remaining thermal energy outward to stabilize the tectonic plates. They anchored the moving rock with their own dense skeletal structures, physically locking the massive land masses into place, ensuring the structural integrity of the sphere. Among these stabilizing spirits stood Yafrei. His towering body already showed advanced signs of calcification, with thick layers of porous stone coating his limbs and torso. He walked to the center of a wide, sinking basin, kneeling directly onto the cooling mud. Yafrei plunged his arms into the soil up to his shoulders and released the very last of his internal light. His physical form dissolved entirely into the dirt. The rough stone covering his limbs spread rapidly, turning his bones into deep veins of solid ore and load-bearing bedrock. His vocal cords stretched and snapped, unraveling into the strict physical properties of acoustics, dictating exactly how sound waves would travel through the dense atmospheric gases. The thick fluid pumping through his chest burst outward and seeped into the ground, establishing the precise evaporation and condensation cycles of the oceans and the heavy rain clouds. Following Yafrei's actions, dozens of other spirits dropped into the dirt and dissolved their remaining mass. They poured their final reserves of kinetic energy into the dirt, their physical bodies unwinding into invisible tethers of force. The scholars call these entirely expended spirits the earth bones. They form the rigid, mechanical framework of Mundus. Because of their physical dissolution, gravity maintains a constant, measurable downward pull on the surface. Linear momentum operates with absolute mathematical precision, and biological decay progresses at a steady, observable rate. The buried bodies of these spirits dictate the strict natural laws that govern every falling stone, every shifting tide, and every gust of heavy wind sweeping across the plains. Other spirits observed the complete physical loss of the earth bones and sought a different mechanical method to remain on the surface. Their massive bodies continued to shed thermal energy, and the crushing atmospheric pressure forced their heavy spines to bend. Their glowing skin cracked and flaked away, revealing softer, highly vulnerable tissue underneath. They recognized their large forms required an unsustainable amount of caloric energy to operate in the decaying environment. To maintain a physical presence on the crust, they gripped their own chests and deliberately fragmented their mass. A single towering spirit tore its remaining light into two smaller pieces, compressing the raw energy into two compact, dense shapes. These smaller forms stood only a fraction of the original height, possessing narrow limbs, short torsos, and small, low-heat cores. The original spirit collapsed into dry ash, its structural integrity completely spent in the fragmentation process. The smaller forms absorbed the residual heat, utilizing the recycled matter to build internal organs capable of processing the heavy water and raw minerals of the surface. By continuously splitting their mass and passing their diminished energy into new, smaller bodies, the spirits established a repeating biological cycle. They manufactured smaller, less demanding vessels to outlast the rapid erosion of the world, generating offspring to carry their biological lineage forward through the passing sequences of time. These fragmented descendants walked across the newly stabilized dirt, pulling the thick, heavy air into their small lungs. They stood upright on two legs, wrapping their cooling bodies in the thick, fibrous plant matter that grew from the enriched soil. They possessed 5 digits on each hand, allowing them to grasp the sharp stones and broken branches scattered across the plains. The texts identify these early beings as the El Nofe. They carried a faint, residual pulse of the original golden light in their veins, yet their physical frames operated strictly within the biological constraints of mortality. They required constant hydration from the freshwater rivers, and they sought immediate shelter from the freezing atmospheric currents under the jagged overhangs of the granite mountains. Their bare feet left shallow, uniform prints in the wet mud as they traversed the massive, unbroken continents. The El Nofe gathered in large numbers, walking shoulder to shoulder across the rugged terrain to combine their body heat. They broke the sharp stones against the bedrock, crafting crude tools to cut the thick vegetation. They traveled across vast plains of crushed gravel and dense mud, their footprints mapping the earliest migratory paths of the mortal plane. As they spread outward across the heavy continents, they encountered the thick, towering flora that had independently taken root in the deep, nutrient-rich swamps, stopping to observe the massive, fibrous trunks of the ancient trees that dominated the eastern marshes. The fragmented El Nofe stood at the edges of the deep eastern swamps, examining the massive root systems tearing through the damp soil. These towering plants possessed thick, scaled bark and leaked a luminous, thick amber sap from deep fissures in their trunks. Their root networks penetrated hundreds of feet down into the planetary crust, wrapping directly around the calcified bones of the expended spirits. They absorbed the leaking magic and thermal energy straight from the deep mantle, pulling the glowing fluids up through their massive internal capillaries. The scholars name these massive, deeply rooted organisms the hist. They stood entirely motionless in the dense, sucking mud, their wide canopies blocking out the solar radiation from the tear in the sky. The hist operated as stationary, highly complex biological systems, surviving the turbulent cooling of Nirn by anchoring themselves entirely to the deepest, most stable layers of the tectonic plates. The El Nofi walked across the exposed roots of the hist, stepping over the pools of glowing sap as they continued their migrations across the shifting land masses. A large concentration of the fragmented El Nofi gathered in a dense, heavily forested region in the northern hemisphere. The atmospheric temperature in this region remained stable and warm, allowing these beings to conserve their internal heat. They pooled their physical strength, lifting massive basalt slabs and stacking them on top of one another. They constructed high walls, wide, flat terraces, and enclosed shelters among the towering trunks of this elder wood, a region the texts identify as Altmora. They organized into massive, coordinated groups, establishing strict, guarded perimeters around their newly built stone cities. By remaining in this stable environment, they maintained a steady, unbroken physical lineage, keeping their biological forms relatively uniform over successive generations. Their skin retained a faint, continuous golden shimmer, and they possessed long, straight limbs with smooth musculature. They collected the remaining pools of ambient magic found within their walled cities, fueling their bodies with the concentrated energy and avoiding the rapid physical degradation occurring in the harsher climates. Other groups of El Nofi found themselves cut off from the stable northern forests. As the tectonic plates shifted, wide saltwater oceans flooded the lowlands, and massive geological barriers isolated these populations. They walked across shifting sand dunes, jagged ice sheets, and barren volcanic rock. They marched continuously to locate fresh water and find shelter from the extreme weather patterns sweeping across the fragmented continents. Over successive generations of physical fragmentation, their bodies adapted to the harsh topographies. Their skin darkened and thickened into leathery hides under the unfiltered solar radiation and the abrasive wind. Their limbs grew thicker and shorter, packing dense muscle fiber to better navigate the uneven, rocky terrain. They broke apart deposits of obsidian and sharpened the femurs of dead animals, binding the pieces together with dried sinew to forge crude tools and weapons. They carried these weapons continuously, using them to pierce the thick hides of the large, scaled beasts inhabiting the wilderness. The texts label these highly adaptable, nomadic groups the Wandering Elnofi. The Wandering Elnofi moved across the continents in massive columns, their bare feet packing the loose dirt into hard trails. They followed the scattered veins of ambient magic and the receding water lines, constantly searching for highly concentrated energy sources to fuel their bodies. Their long migrations eventually brought them to the borders of the established northern territories. They walked out of the sparse, rocky plains and stood outside the high stone walls of Altmora. They held their bone spears and obsidian axes tightly, their thick, leathery fingers gripping the wooden shafts. They looked up at the towering basalt structures and the uniform, shimmering figures standing on the elevated terraces. The Elnofe, inside the walls, looked down at the hardened wanderers covered in dirt and animal hides. The two groups stood separated by the heavy stone walls, observing the severe physical divergences resulting from their different environments. The wanderers raised their obsidian weapons, their vocal cords emitting sharp, loud demands for access to the stable land and the pooled magic behind the gates. The inhabitants of the stone cities responded by lifting large, polished metal shields and drawing back heavy bows strung with treated animal fiber. The wanderers struck the stone walls with the blunt ends of their spears, chipping the basalt and sending loud, rhythmic cracking sounds echoing across the plains. The figures on the walls knocked long wooden arrows to their bowstrings, pulling the tension tight against the wood. The kinetic energy between the two groups escalated rapidly, vibrating the heavy air between the raised weapons and the fortified gates, initiating the first strikes of a massive physical confrontation. The jagged obsidian spears left the hands of the wandering Elnofi and struck the golden-skinned defenders standing on the basalt terraces. The heavy stone points punctured their smooth musculature, releasing pressurized streams of luminescent fluid that burned through the stone flooring. The defenders returned fire, pulling back tight animal fiber bowstrings and launching polished metal arrows into the mass of thick-hided wanderers. The arrows tore through the leathery skin, pinning the heavily muscled bodies to the packed dirt below the walls. The kinetic impact of thousands of bodies colliding generated massive shockwaves that cracked the stone fortifications and uprooted the surrounding fibrous trees. The combatants retained a high concentration of the raw, malleable energy from the early Arbis, causing their physical strikes to instantly alter the immediate environment. The physical laws of the world functioned as literal weapons in their hands. A golden defender bringing a heavy metal hammer down upon a wanderer's skull simultaneously inverted the gravitational pull in a 10-foot radius, sending loose gravel and broken armor falling upward into the sky. A thick-hided attacker swung a jagged blade and physically severed the spatial distance between the two armies, pulling the opposing front lines instantaneously together without either side crossing the intervening ground. When a severed limb hit the mud, it rapidly replicated its cellular structure, growing into a dense, sprawling thicket of razor-sharp brambles. Shouted commands compressed the atmospheric gases into solid, invisible walls that crushed the lungs of the charging infantry. The friction of the overlapping energies boiled the freshwater rivers into scalding vapor and compressed the soft mud into solid diamond ridges. The massive, ash-covered form of Lorcan strode through the center of the battlefield. The polished metal arrows struck his dense, chaotic mass and flattened against his skin, dropping to the dirt without penetrating his hide. He walked directly to the foundations of the elder wood and raised his thick, heavy fists. He drove both arms downward into the bedrock. The sheer physical force of the impact snapped the underlying tectonic plate in half. Deep, jagged fissures ripped across the northern continent, severing the massive root networks of the towering trees. The thick wood fibers tore apart under the shifting rock, and the luminous sap crystallized instantly as freezing salt water from the northern ocean surged into the deep cracks. The water rapidly flooded the lowlands and dropped the ambient atmospheric temperature. Thick layers of heavy frost and glacial ice immediately coated the crushed basalt walls and the splintered wooden trunks of Altmora, permanently freezing the once stable environment. Auriel stood on a shifting, icy landmass at the center of the collapsing city. His golden armor carried deep, jagged gouges, and his internal thermal core flickered under the extreme drop in temperature. He tilted his head back and projected a concentrated, high-frequency acoustic wave upward through the freezing atmosphere. He directed this beam toward the distant, unbroken light of Anu, vibrating the energetic tether to request immediate physical extraction from the heavy, decaying sphere. The pure white light above remained completely static. The acoustic wave dissipated into the upper atmosphere. No thermal energy or kinetic force reached down to pull him out of the sinking, ice-covered dirt. A secondary concentration of light pooled in the sky directly above the battlefield. This energy condensed rapidly, dropping through the freezing air as a solid, high-mass projectile. It struck the glacial ice at Auriel's feet, shattering the frozen surface and sending plumes of hot steam into the air. The light cooled into a massive, curved bow composed of blinding white metal and a wide, circular shield radiating intense thermal heat. Auriel gripped the weapons. The heat emanating from the shield immediately melted the encroaching ice from his legs, and the heavy draw weight of the bow pulsed with stable, structured kinetic energy, directly resupplying his fading internal core. Auriel raised the glowing shield, intercepting the heavy, chaotic impacts of Lorcan's advancing forces. The surface of the shield repelled the kinetic energy, sending the thick-hided attackers tumbling backward across the jagged ice. He knocked arrows of pure, highly concentrated stasis energy to the metal bowstring, firing them directly into the charging masses. The arrows pierced the bodies of the wandering Elnofi, instantly calcifying their internal organs and locking their limbs into stationary pillars of hard salt and dense rock. The remaining golden-skinned defenders rallied behind the radiating heat of the shield, pushing the dark, ash-covered forces backward across the shifting tectonic plates. The millions of combatants ground the surface of Nirn under their heavy feet, pulverizing the granite mountains into flat plains of loose gravel. The immense physical devastation threatened to grind the entire planetary crust back into the void, forcing the surviving original spirits to halt the heavy impacts and call for a centralized physical gathering to establish permanent, unbreakable parameters for the chaotic world. The massive, glowing spirits ceased their physical strikes and pulled back from the pulverized fault lines. They converged on a single, isolated landmass surrounded by the boiling salt water of the Western Ocean. To stabilize this specific island against the constant tectonic shifting, the Aedra forged a single, massive cylindrical spike out of a highly dense, gray metal. They lifted this metallic cylinder high into the thick atmosphere and drove it straight down into the bedrock. The massive physical impact sent a deafening metallic ring across the continent, instantly vaporizing the surrounding salt water into thick clouds of white steam. The spike penetrated through the crust and locked the shifting tectonic plate firmly into the deep planetary mantle. The scholars identify this metallic structure as the Adamantine Tower, the Tower, the first permanent physical building constructed on Nirn. The fragmented Elnofi, scattered across the distant shores, felt the heavy vibrations in the dirt and turned their heads to observe the towering grey metal piercing the sky. The surviving Etadar walked through the high, arched entryways of the metal cylinder and gathered in the central chamber. Their physical bodies displayed the severe damage incurred during the combat. The golden armor of Auriel carried deep dents and scorch marks. Other spirits limped on fractured, calcified legs, their skin leaking a faint, sputtering light onto the polished metal floor. They formed a wide circle, their heavy breathing echoing off the smooth grey walls. The air inside the chamber quickly filled with the smell of heated copper, burning ozone, and dried blood. Into the center of this metallic room, a towering spirit named Trinimac dragged the ash-covered form of Lorcan. Trinimac possessed a massive frame coated in thick, interlocking plates of bright bronze, and he carried a heavy broadsword strapped across his back. He gripped Lorcan by the shoulders, his thick fingers digging into the dark, chaotic sludge that formed Lorcan's skin. Trinimac forced Lorcan down onto the metallic floor, pressing his heavy bronze boots against the back of Lorcan's knees to lock his joints in place. Lorcan knelt on the smooth metal, his chest expanding and contracting, shedding flakes of grey ash under the intense physical pressure applied by his captor. Auriel stepped forward, holding the glowing white shield and the heavy starlight bow. He pointed the tip of the bow directly at Lorcan's pulsing chest. The gathered spirits raised their voices, projecting loud, highly structured acoustic waves across the room. They catalogued the exact volume of light drained from their bodies, the physical calcification of their limbs, and the rapid degradation of the planetary crust. They laid out the crumbling pieces of the original dirt model on the metal floor, displaying the deliberate physical imbalance in the blueprints. The concentrated acoustic vibrations hit Lorcan's dark skin, detailing his specific manipulation of their kinetic energy to forge a world that strictly consumed their mass. The scholars call this physical gathering the convention, the moment the remaining architects tallied the physical costs and dictated the final structure of reality. During this gathering, the spirits physically inscribed the permanent parameters of Mundus into the thick metal walls of the adamantine tower. They dragged their glowing fingertips across the grey alloy, applying intense heat and pressure to burn deep grooves into the surface. These grooves formed complex geometric equations that locked the remaining physical properties of the sphere into place. They carved the exact trajectory of the ocean tides, the specific reproductive cycles of the cellular flora, the precise friction coefficients for moving objects, and the maximum velocity of falling water. Sparks of white-hot metal showered the floor as they worked, the screech of tearing alloy echoing through the chamber and filling the room with the sharp tang of molten iron. By searing these formulas into the indestructible metal of the Tower, they established the final, unyielding laws of nature. The fragmented Elnofe outside the tower immediately adhered to these locked parameters, their cellular structures stabilizing and their biological decay standardizing to a constant, measurable rate based entirely on the mathematical lines glowing within the walls. The Aedra then looked through the wide arches of the tower at the devastated landscape outside. The ground consisted of pulverized gravel, shattered timber, and deep craters filled with stagnant water. They observed the massive shockwaves generated by their own footsteps and the intense thermal radiation leaking from their cracked skin. Their continued physical presence on the crust actively dismantled the very stone they had drained their bodies to build. Their large-scale movements triggered violent earthquakes, and their high-heat cores boiled the remaining freshwater rivers. They calculated the exact friction and kinetic output of their massive frames. The results showed that remaining on the ground would rapidly grind the surviving land masses into dust. To preserve the physical integrity of Nirn, the Aedra prepared to vacate the immediate surface. They planned to extract their massive, high-heat bodies from the fragile dirt and ascend into the upper layers of the heavy atmosphere. From that elevated orbital position, they could beam their remaining thermal energy down to the surface at a safe, regulated distance, maintaining the structural stability of the planet without directly crushing the rock beneath their heavy boots. They looked back at Lorcan, kneeling on the floor under Trinimac's heavy grip. The creator of the highly entropic system remained firmly bound in the center of the room. The Aedra determined the dense, chaotic mass of his body presented the greatest physical threat to the newly stabilized environment. Releasing him from the tower would deposit his dark, viscous energy back onto the vulnerable tectonic plates. They stepped closer to the kneeling figure, drawing their long, jagged blades and raising their heavy, flat-faced hammers. The heat radiating from their readied weapons warped the air around them as they calculated the exact angles required to physically dismantle his ash-covered body and permanently extract his chaotic core. Trinimac stepped to the front of the circle, dropping his heavy bronze sword onto the metal floor. He reached down and plunged his thick, armored hands directly into Lorcan's chest. The dark ash and chaotic sludge covering Lorcan's body parted under the intense pressure of Trinimac's grip. The high-heat bronze burned through the dense matter, exposing the massive, vibrating core hidden inside. This core pulsed with the raw, volatile energy of the void, throwing off thick sparks of black light that scorched the surrounding armor plates. Trinimac locked his thick fingers around the sides of the core, planted his heavy boots firmly onto the floor, and pulled upward with a massive exertion of physical force. The thick, viscous fluid connecting the core to Lorcan's internal structure snapped, and Trinimac tore the heart completely free from the chest cavity. He held the pulsing mass of dark energy high above his head. The raw chaos bleeding from the heart immediately began corroding the bronze plates of Trinimac's gauntlets, sending thick drops of molten metal splashing onto the floor. The other spirits, particularly the ancestors of the High Elves, raised their own weapons, shouting loud, acoustic commands to crush the core and eliminate the chaotic variable permanently. Trinimac brought his thick fists down, driving the vibrating mass against the indestructible grey alloy of the adamantine tower. He struck the heart repeatedly with the full weight of his armored body, attempting to flatten the dense material and extinguish the internal heat. The heavy impacts sent deafening shockwaves through the central chamber, vibrating the engraved mathematical lines on the walls. The outer layer of the heart cracked, throwing off jagged shards of black crystal, but the core itself refused to compress. It possessed a unique physical density, directly tethered to the massive rocky structure of the world outside. When Trinimac struck the heart, a corresponding tremor ripped across the tectonic plates of Nirn, causing massive fissures to open in the basalt crust and sending towers of magma shooting into the atmosphere. The Aedra realized that the physical composition of the new world consisted entirely of Lorcan's expelled matter. The dirt, the water, and the heavy air all contained trace elements of his chaotic blood. The core, held in Trinimac's hands, functioned as the central kinetic engine for the entire sphere. Because Nirn was physically constructed from the body of Lorcan, crushing the heart would simultaneously shatter the gravitational and thermodynamic bonds holding the planet together. Auriel stepped forward, his golden armor reflecting the erratic pulses of the black light. He signaled Trinimac to stop the physical strikes. To preserve the structural integrity of the world they had sacrificed their mass to build, The heart had to remain intact, but it could not remain inside the adamantine tower. Auriel extended his own glowing hands and took the heavy, vibrating core from Trinamac. He clamped the massive piece of dark matter onto the thick string of his starlight bow, wrapping his fingers tightly around the metal cord. He pulled the heavy string backward, bending the white metal of the bow to its absolute physical limit. He angled the weapon upward, pointing the tip past the curved archways of the tower and aiming toward the distant eastern horizon. With a sharp exhale, he released the tension. The string snapped forward, launching the massive, heavy heart into the heavy atmosphere. The core streaked across the sky, a dark, burning projectile carving a wide trail of displaced gas and trailing black ash through the clouds. It flew over the flooded plains and the deep swamps, generating a massive slipstream that pulled the loose dirt and gravel upward into its wake. The heavy mass struck the eastern edge of the main continent with the force of a falling moon. The impact instantly pulverized the bedrock in a 100-mile radius, pushing millions of tons of superheated granite and molten mantle outward into a towering circular ridge. The heart sank deep into the center of this newly formed crater, burying itself beneath layers of boiling rock and pressurized ash. The extreme thermal output of the buried core immediately ignited the surrounding stone, creating a massive, continuously erupting volcano. The towering cone of ash and fire dominated the eastern landscape, spewing thick clouds of dark soot into the atmosphere and leaving a permanent, smoking scar on the terrain. The later elves would name this massive geological formation the Red Mountain, and the land surrounding it would become known as Resdain and eventually Morrowind. The extraction of the core left Lorcan's physical form an empty, hollowed-out shell kneeling on the metal floor of the tower. Deprived of its central kinetic engine, the dark sludge lost its cohesion, the heavy limbs slumped downward, and the ash flaked away, spreading across the floor. The texts carry different accounts of this specific physical sequence. The elves record the total cessation of his kinetic energy, declaring him dead on the floor of the Tower. The tribes of men describe him kneeling willingly, accepting the extraction to finalize the heavy physics of the world. Regardless of the acoustic records, his solid form did not remain on the ground. The massive, hollowed shell began to separate into two distinct, massive chunks of dense matter, preparing to ascend into the upper atmosphere alongside the departing spirits. The empty shell of dark ash kneeling on the metal floor of the adamantine tower cracked straight down the center. The heavy sludge separated into two asymmetrical halves, the thick matter tearing apart with a sound like splitting timber. The residual thermal energy radiating from the nearby Aedra heated the ash, causing the two massive chunks to expand rapidly. They lifted off the polished floor, scraping against the gray alloy archways and leaving thick, permanent streaks of black soot on the metal. The two masses pushed upward through the thick, sulfurous air, accelerating past the heavy cloud layer. They broke through the upper limits of the atmosphere and entered the dark, cold space directly surrounding the planetary crust. In the freezing vacuum, the two chunks of chaotic matter compacted under their own massive gravitational force, crushing themselves into dense, spherical shapes. The larger mass absorbed the sweeping clouds of red particulate dust expelled from the immense volcanic eruption in the east. The heated dust coated the sphere, giving it a deep, rust-colored hue that absorbed the surrounding starlight. The smaller mass condensed rapidly, the extreme vacuum cold, cracking its surface into a cratered, uneven globe of pale, silver-gray rock. These two massive bodies established a locked, elliptical orbital path around Nirn. The raw radiation pouring from the massive tear in the outer barrier struck their surfaces, casting bright, shifting reflections down onto the darkened dirt below. The gravitational pull of these two hovering spheres immediately gripped the pooling salt water of the oceans, dragging the massive bodies of water back and forth across the jagged continental shelves in a rhythmic, repeating sequence. The surviving Elnaphe stood on the mudflats, tracking the massive shadows sweeping across the landscape and observing the physical manifestation of the dark spirit's fractured mass rotating constantly above their heads. Inside the metal cylinder of the tower, the remaining Aedra finished pressing their glowing fingers into the walls. They connected the final geometric lines, closing the complex mathematical equations burned deep into the alloy. A resonant hum vibrated through the grey metal, spreading outward through the bedrock and radiating across the tectonic plates. The erratic energy fluctuations across the globe ceased instantly under the weight of the inscribed laws. The thick atmospheric gases separated into distinct, stable layers based on their chemical mass. The pooling magma beneath the crust cooled into structured igneous rock at a uniform, predictable rate. The physical vibration of time adopted a steady, uniform pulse. The rhythmic energy aligned perfectly with the rotation of the planet, moving in a continuous line from one sunrise to the next. The golden-skinned spirits turned away from the engraved walls. They bent their heavy, calcified legs, dug their boots into the metal floor, and launched themselves upward. The extreme kinetic force of their jump sent concussive shockwaves rippling through the tower's deep foundations. They ascended through the heavy air, their bodies generating intense friction and trailing thick streams of white heat across the sky. They broke through the atmospheric barrier and entered the dark void alongside the two spinning ash moons. Once in the open vacuum, they shed their humanoid structures entirely. Their long limbs and armored torsos expanded outward, the glowing matter fusing into massive, perfect spheres. They became vast globes of glowing liquid rock, dense heavy metals, and swirling atmospheric gas, burning in shades of deep red, bright blue, and pale gold. They settled into wide concentric orbital paths around Neon. The remaining Aedra transformed into 8 massive planets, radiating regulated thermal energy and structured gravitational fields down onto the mortal plane from a safe, calculated distance. The shifting tectonic plates locked into their final grooves, bringing the surface to a standstill. The heavy rains fell at consistent intervals, washing the thick volcanic ash from the broad leaves of the eastern swamps and filling the deep basins with clear, cold freshwater. The freezing temperatures solidified the immense ice caps at the northern poles, sending freezing winds rolling across the jagged plains. The flora took firm root in the heavy soil, extracting nutrients through complex, repeating cellular processes. The fragmented Elnaphe tracked the strict sequence of cause and effect, measuring the passing physical moments by the rotation of the sun, the 8 planets, and the 2 massive moons. They gathered sharp stones, striking them together to create small, contained fires against the coming cold. They carved deep marks into the trunks of the trees and chipped notches into the basalt stones, recording the continuous cycles of light and dark. The atmospheric pressure held constant, pinning the loose dust to the heavy crust. A handful of the towering beings chose to stay firmly planted on the dirt, retaining their humanoid forms and their heavy weapons. The high heat energy of the early construction phase still lingered in the blood of these remaining spirits on the crust. This volatile thermal energy fueled immediate, severe physical mutations among these golden-skinned defenders, concentrating heavily on the towering, bronze-armored warrior standing amidst the scattered ash of the shattered world. Trinimac stepped out of the adamantine tower, his heavy bronze boots sinking into the wet mud. The thick plates of his armor retained a high concentration of the original thermal heat, steaming as the cold rainwater hit the metal. A large group of the fragmented El Nofi, those who closely tracked the lineage of the golden-skinned defenders, gathered around him. They observed the dark soot covering his gauntlets from the extraction of Lorcan's core. As Trinimac raised his arms to address his followers, the atmospheric temperature around him dropped abruptly. The thick air turned frigid, and a massive, localized shadow swept across the ground, blocking out the light of the sun. The source of the shadow descended rapidly from the upper layers of the heavy clouds. A towering, shifting entity, composed entirely of dark, chaotic sludge, landed directly in front of Trinimac, its hooves cracking the bedrock beneath the mud. This entity was Boethia. Boethia belonged to the Daedra, having previously retreated into oblivion during the construction of Mundus. The massive spirit observed Trinimac's physical form, focusing entirely on the raw stasis energy still radiating from his bronze plates. Boethia extended long, jagged claws and gripped Trinimac by the shoulders. The thick, chaotic matter of Boethia's body flowed forward, completely enveloping Trinimac's metallic frame. The intense friction between the pure chaos and the concentrated stasis energy generated a blinding flash of volatile black light, followed by a concussive shockwave that leveled the surrounding trees and knocked the gathered El Nofi to the dirt. Inside the dark mass, the rigid physical structure of Trinimac broke down. The heat drained from his core, and the strict geometric lines dictating his form unraveled. The bronze armor plates melted, fusing directly with his skin. His smooth, proportional limbs contorted, the bones thickening and bending under extreme physical pressure. His lower jaw thrust forward, forcing two massive tusks to tear through his upper lip. The golden shimmer of his skin extinguished entirely, replaced by a thick, coarse hide, the color of bruised green flesh. When Boethia finally pulled back, releasing the physical hold, the entity standing in the mud bore no resemblance to the original architect. Trinimac had undergone a complete biological and structural mutation, transforming into a massive, heavy-set being. The subsequent texts label this new physical form Malakath, a being composed of dense muscle, thick bone, and jagged iron. The volatile energy from the transformation did not dissipate into the air. Instead, it rolled outward in a heavy, visible shockwave, washing over the golden-skinned El Nofi who had followed Trinimac. The wave struck their bodies, instantly transferring the same rapid mutation to their cellular structures. Their straight limbs thickened and shortened, packing dense layers of muscle over widening skeletons. Their skin turned the same coarse, dark green as their master. Thick tusks ripped through their jaws, and their eyes shrank under heavy, protruding brow ridges. They dropped to their hands and knees in the mud, their vocal cords emitting deep, guttural roars as their internal organs adapted to the severe biological shift. This newly mutated offshoot group became the Orsima, the Orcs, physically severed from the original, uniform appearance of their kin. Malakath gripped his heavy, molten sword, the metal now twisted into a jagged, brutal cleaver. He turned his heavy head toward the towering peaks in the distance, establishing a new physical territory far from the smooth terraces of Altmora. The newly formed Orsima picked up their bone spears and obsidian axes, their thick fingers gripping the shafts tightly. They fell into step behind Malakath, their heavy, wide feet leaving deep tracks in the mud. The physical transformation altered their dietary and environmental requirements. They sought out the harshest, most abrasive environments on the crust, moving toward the jagged, high-altitude mountain ranges and the frozen northern tundra. They built their settlements using rough, unhewn boulders and thick animal hides, embracing the heavy physical labor required to survive in the most extreme conditions available on Nirn. The mutation of Trinimac into Malakath marked a distinct shift in the physical reality of the sphere. The direct, massive-scale interventions by the towering original spirits ceased. The intense, unfiltered magic bleeding from the tear in the sky began to thin and disperse as the heavy atmospheric gases stabilized. The extreme volatility that allowed a spirit to instantly rewrite the cellular structure of an entire population faded. The physical laws engraved in the adamantine tower fully locked into place, dictating strict, unyielding biological reproduction and environmental erosion. The towering entities no longer walked the surface to rip tectonic plates apart or shatter continents. The remaining populations of fragmented Elnofi were left to navigate the hardened crust, relying entirely on their own generated caloric energy, physical strength, and the raw materials they could extract from the dirt. The initial chaotic formation of the world concluded, and the continuous, linear progression of recorded physical events commenced. The stabilization of the planetary crust and the establishment of strict physical laws marked the beginning of a linear chronological sequence. The erratic, overlapping events of the construction phase ceased, replaced by a continuous forward progression of time. The scholars trace the start of this measurable period to the exact moment the adamantine tower pierced the bedrock, pinning the tectonic plates into a permanent arrangement. Because the massive golden spirits no longer walked the surface to alter the terrain, the fragmented Elnofe began to record the passage of physical events. They tracked the rising and setting of the sun, noting the predictable shift of shadows across the dirt. They observed the distinct phases of the two moons, using the repeated orbital cycles to measure the duration of their own lifespans. This structured span of recorded time is known as the Merethic era, an age dominated by the earliest descendants of the original architects. The recording of dates during this early era functioned differently than in later centuries. The human scribes of the northern continent established a retroactive calendar, selecting the construction of the adamantine tower as the earliest identifiable physical event. They designated this point as ME 2500, setting the starting date far in the past. From that fixed anchor, they counted backward chronologically, ticking down the years as the era progressed toward its conclusion at ME1. This backward numbering system relies heavily on the physical layering of dirt and the gradual degradation of the early stone structures. A year marked ME 1000 sits physically higher in the sedimentary rock layers than a year marked ME 2000. Because the Merethic era covers the vast stretch of time between the final stabilization of the globe and the widespread rise of human civilizations, it is primarily the era of the elves. The descendants of the golden-skinned Elnofe, who gathered in the warm forests of Altmora and across the southern continents, held near total control over the physical resources of Nirn. They built massive, sprawling cities out of polished limestone and thick marble, utilizing the concentrated ambient magic pooled within the continent to fuel early metallurgical forges and irrigation systems. The human scribes working with the retroactive calendar possess very few specific dates from this period. The physical evidence consists mostly of scattered, heavily eroded stone ruins and petrified bone fragments buried deep within the crust. The specific details of the Merethic era rely heavily on oral traditions passed down through generations of elven speakers. The physical text records from this time are carved onto dense clay tablets and brittle animal hides, resulting in massive gaps in the timeline due to physical decay. The raw environmental mechanics of Nirn, the heavy rainfall, the abrasive winds, and the corrosive saltwater, ground many of the earliest elven structures into fine sand long before human scholars began assigning numbers to the dirt layers. A scribe analyzing a thick piece of carved limestone from ME 1500 must account for centuries of shifting soil and localized tectonic tremors that often displaced the physical evidence. Consequently, the events of the Merethic era frequently blend with the residual myths of the construction period. The exact migration paths of the wandering El Nofi and the specific dates of the earliest stone fortifications often contradict one another across different archaeological sites. The human scholars cross-reference the depths of the buried fire pits with the erosion patterns on the surrounding bedrock, attempting to piece together the linear progression of the elven expansion. Despite the gaps in the physical record, the fundamental structure of the era remains clear. The heavy atmosphere maintained a constant pressure, the ocean tides followed the exact pull of the two moons, and the biological entities on the surface adhered to the strict reproductive and decay cycles engraved into the adamantine tower. The massive, towering entities of the previous age remained locked in their high-altitude orbits, their thermal energy reaching the ground only as diffused sunlight. The physical terrain of Nirn was set, providing a vast, unbroken continent of raw materials, waiting to be harvested and shaped by the hands of the descendants. These early elven populations gathered their tools, turned away from the localized pockets of warmth, and began to march outward, looking to expand their stone cities across the entire landmass. The early elven populations marched across the stabilized dirt of the primary landmass. They carried polished stone tools and wore thick layers of spun plant fiber to insulate their bodies against the dropping temperatures. A massive group of these golden-skinned beings broke away from the frozen ruins of Altmora and moved relentlessly southward. They navigated entirely by tracking the dense, ambient magical currents pooled within the continent's interior. After generations of continuous walking, their bare feet wearing deep grooves into the limestone, they reached the southernmost coast of the landmass. Across a wide expanse of deep, turbulent salt water, they located a large cluster of isolated islands. The air above these islands shimmered with a high concentration of unspent thermal energy, and the thick soil retained a heavy pulse of the original stasis magic. The scribes identify this distant, energy-rich archipelago as Aldmeris, the ancestral homeland of the elves. The migrating elves constructed flat-bottomed vessels from the thick, fibrous trunks of the coastal trees, binding the wood together with dried vines and sealing the gaps with hardened tree sap. They pushed these heavy rafts into the freezing surf, utilizing broad wooden paddles to break through the crashing waves. Thousands of elves crossed the saltwater strait, landing their vessels on the smooth, white sand beaches of the archipelago. Once on the islands, the warm, stable atmosphere halted their rapid biological decay. Their skin retained its metallic, golden sheen, and their physical height stabilized, avoiding the severe muscular thickening and bone calcification experienced by the wandering populations in the harsher northern climates. They named themselves the Aldmer, the first folk. Within the concentrated magical field of Aldmeris, the Aldmer bypassed the crude stone-chipping phase of the wandering tribes. They tapped directly into the residual stasis energy radiating from the dirt. By channeling this raw magic through their long fingers, they melted heavy veins of copper and tin directly from the bedrock, bypassing the need for physical fire pits. They fused the liquid metals into bronze, casting sharp, durable tools and heavy, interlocking plates of armor. They cut massive blocks of white marble and dense limestone straight from the cliffs, using focused acoustic waves to shatter the stone with exact geometric precision. They stacked these blocks into towering, symmetrical spires and wide, flat plazas, building the first advanced, structured cities since the destruction of Altmora. The Aldmer established a highly organized, heavily stratified society based on strict physical lineage and direct proximity to the residual magic. The tallest elves, possessing the brightest golden skin, claimed the highest terraces of the marble cities, standing closest to the unfiltered sunlight. The physical characteristics dictated their societal roles. Those with shorter limbs and duller skin worked the heavy bronze forges in the lower levels or harvested the thick vegetation along the beaches. They completely abandoned the chaotic, disorganized survival tactics of the wandering tribes, implementing rigid, documented systems of agriculture and masonry. They developed the first physical recording system since the markings on the adamantine tower. The Aldmer scribes pressed sharp bronze styluses into wet clay tablets, carving complex runic symbols that catalogued their agricultural yields, their metallurgical formulas, and their strict genealogical lines. They recorded the physical details of the construction period, specifically documenting the violent extraction of Lorcan's core. Their clay tablets detailed the precise drop in thermal energy and the resulting degradation of the Aedra's bodies. They identified the dark, ash-covered spirit as the architect of their physical decay, entirely blaming Lorcan for their reduction from towering, immortal entities to smaller, biologically bound forms. They engraved deep, aggressive warnings against the chaotic energy of the void, instructing their descendants to avoid the volatile magic of the Daedra at all costs. Their population expanded rapidly within the warm, nutrient-dense environment of the islands. The coastal settlements quickly filled to capacity, forcing the lower strata elves to construct new bronze-reinforced rafts. The Aldmer launched massive fleets of these heavy vessels back across the saltwater strait, aiming to reclaim the massive landmass of Tamriel. They landed on the jagged western coasts and the dense, swampy southern shores, driving their wooden hulls deep into the mudflats. They carried their bronze swords, their clay tablets, and their focused acoustic magic onto the mainland. They marched inland, cutting down the thick forests and shattering the basalt boulders to clear the ground for new marble foundations, immediately establishing a rigid, ordered perimeter around their landing zones. As they pushed deeper into the dense jungles and the rocky plains, their advanced scouts reported movement in the thick underbrush, confirming that the isolated, fragmented descendants of the early wandering tribes already occupied the continent. The descendants of the wandering El Nofi already inhabited the thick jungles and deep swamps of Tamriel. Successive generations of exposure to unfiltered magic and harsh terrain had severely altered their physical forms. In the dense southern jungles, a population emerged with fine fur covering their bodies, long prehensile tails, and sharp, retractable claws on their fingers and toes. The elves later named these feline bipeds the Khajiit. In the deep eastern marshes, another group adapted entirely to the toxic water, developing thick, waterproof scales, webbed digits, and gills capable of filtering oxygen directly from the muddy runoff. The scholars label this reptilian group the Argonians. Both populations relied on physical camouflage and rapid movement through the thick brush, building small, temporary shelters out of dried leaves and woven vines. When the golden-skinned Aldmer pushed inland from the coasts, they brought heavy bronze axes and structured acoustic magic. The Aldmer marched in rigid formations, cutting wide, straight paths through the jungle canopy. They encountered the furred and scaled inhabitants and observed their lack of metal tools and permanent stone structures. The Aldmer immediately utilized their focused sound waves to shatter the wooden shelters and scatter the loose tribes. They raised their large metal shields against the wooden spears and stone arrows of the indigenous populations, systematically driving them out of the nutrient-rich river valleys and fertile plains. The Aldmer laid down heavy limestone blocks over the cleared dirt, establishing walled perimeters that entirely excluded the native inhabitants. The Khajiit retreated deep into the dense, high-altitude jungles of elsewhere and the arid southern deserts. Their physical forms remained highly unstable, shifting across generations. Their own myths record this physical fluctuation as a direct result of their environment. They track their origins to a spirit named Azura, who took a group of the early forest people and bound their cellular reproduction to the exact orbital phases of the two moons, Massa and Secunda. The Khajiit refer to this biological tether as the lunar lattice. Because of this connection, a Khajiit born when the moons are full develops a massive quadrupedal frame, weighing hundreds of pounds. A Khajiit born under dark moons grows into a small, agile biped, barely reaching the knees of an Aldmer. This extreme physical variation allowed them to survive the harsh temperatures of the desert and navigate the thick jungle canopy, completely avoiding the rigid, uniform stone cities of the elves. The Argonians withdrew entirely into the toxic depths of Black Marsh. They submerged themselves in the stagnant water, their scaled skin resisting the corrosive properties of the swamp. They formed a permanent, symbiotic biological relationship with the massive, towering hist trees. The Argonians ingested the thick, glowing sap leaking from the bark, allowing the concentrated magic to stabilize their cellular structure. They built their settlements on floating masses of vegetation deep within the marsh, navigating the treacherous waterways where the heavy bronze armor of the Aldmer caused the elves to sink immediately into the mud. By driving the indigenous populations into the most extreme environments on the continent, the Aldmer secured total control over the temperate forests, the open grasslands, and the navigable rivers. They constructed massive, interconnected networks of marble cities spanning the entire western and central regions of Tamriel. They built wide paved roads to move heavy carts of grain and ore between their settlements. The Aldmer effectively isolated themselves from the chaotic mutations of the remaining wandering Elnofi, ensuring their own physical lineage remained unbroken, and their control over the stabilized resources of Nirn remained absolute. However, the sheer size of the continent and the vast distances between their new cities soon initiated distinct physical and cultural divergences among the Aldmer themselves. The Aldmer loaded their bronze tools, clay tablets, and heavy marble statues onto wooden carts with thick, solid wheels. They lashed leather harnesses to captured beasts, driving the animals forward across the coastal plains of Tamriel. The vast geological formations of the continent split the migrating populations into isolated columns. The dense mountain ranges and wide, rapid rivers stretched the physical distance between the settlements to thousands of miles, severing the supply lines and halting the exchange of written records. Over successive generations, the bodies of the elves physically adapted to the diverse environments. The groups settling in the deep, shaded forests of the west developed skin the color of crushed tree bark and wet leaves. their limbs growing leaner to navigate the thick underbrush. The elves, driving their carts into the central river valleys, retained their golden skin and towering height, continuing to cut and stack heavy white limestone. A massive faction of these golden-skinned elves directed their caravans into the deep interior of the continent, entering a sprawling equatorial jungle that surrounded a wide freshwater lake. The human scribes map this central region as Cyrodiil, labeling the elves who occupied the jungle as the Aelids. The Aelids cut down the thick canopy with bronze axes and excavated deep into the bedrock. They quarried a bright, luminescent white stone, stacking the heavy blocks to construct sprawling, multi-tiered cities along the riverbanks. They dragged massive meteoric iron crystals from the craters left by the construction period and embedded them directly into the ceilings of their subterranean vaults. These crystals captured the ambient starlight, illuminating the deep chambers with a cold blue glow. The Aelids retained the original acoustic language of the early golden spirits, projecting highly structured sound waves to manipulate the heavy stones and water currents around their settlements. They carved the exact geometric runes of the Dawn era into their limestone archways, utilizing the leaking magic to heat their metallurgical forges and cast complex bronze armaments. The leaders of the Aeliad cities filled flat-bottomed barges with heavy chests of cut emeralds, bundles of bright avian feathers, and raw lumps of meteoric iron. They floated these barges down the wide rivers to the southern coast, transferring the cargo onto deep-water ships bound for the towering crystal spires of Alinor. By transporting this physical wealth across the ocean, the Aelids secured regular shipments of refined weapons and written decrees from the High King of the Somerset Isles. The heavy ships required 6 months to cross the saltwater strait and navigate the winding river systems back to the central lake. Under the friction of this massive physical distance, the Aelids gradually ceased loading the barges with tribute. They stacked higher limestone walls around their cities and expanded their borders into the surrounding plains. They captured the indigenous tribal populations, binding their wrists with thick iron chains and forcing them to drag the heavy quarry stones up the steep ramps of the construction sites. The Aelids established independent city-states ruled by concentrated magical power and heavily armed infantry contingents, severing the physical exchange of resources with the island archipelago. Simultaneously, a tall, golden-skinned elf named Veloth stood on the highest marble steps in Alinor and cast down the polished golden statues of the ancestors. Veloth pointed his thick fingers toward the dark, chaotic pockets of oblivion visible in the night sky. He instructed his followers to elevate the jagged, volatile Daedra as the true sources of kinetic power and arcane knowledge. Veloth packed his heavy bronze tools, leading a massive column of elves down to the docks. They boarded wooden ships, leaving the white beaches of the islands and sailing toward the eastern edge of Tamriel. The texts identify this migrating group as the Chimera, and they record their mass physical exodus across the continent as the High Velothi migration. The Chimera marched across the packed dirt of the continent, following Veloth strictly to the northeast. They dragged their carts over the central plains and navigated the steep, jagged passes of the eastern mountain ranges. They covered their bodies in thick animal hides to block the freezing high-altitude winds and carried long, hooked bronze blades to clear the mountain vegetation. They utilized the fluctuating magic of the Daedra, pulling raw kinetic heat and dark matter directly from oblivion to melt the glacial ice blocking their paths. Their skin took on a darker, ashen hue from their constant exposure to the thick volcanic soot blowing westward from the massive eruption zone of the Red Mountain. Veloth guided the long column of elves into the rugged, ash-covered valleys surrounding the towering volcanic cone. They halted their carts in this geologically unstable region, driving heavy wooden stakes into the grey dirt to mark the perimeters of their new settlements. They erected altars of black basalt and ignited bright green fires, directing their acoustic chants toward the distant realms of the chaotic spirits. As the Chimera expanded their camps across the surface, their scouts climbed the steep, rocky inclines of the surrounding mountain ranges. They located deep, perfectly circular tunnels, bored directly into the solid granite of the cliffs. From these dark, metallic shafts, the rhythmic, deafening clang of heavy steam-powered hammers and the hiss of pressurized gas echoed across the jagged peaks, confirming that another highly advanced faction of elves had already penetrated deep into the subterranean crust of the eastern mountains. The specific group of elves separating from the coastal migrations marched directly into the high-altitude, snow-covered mountain range splitting the northern regions of Tamriel. This jagged chain of grey granite peaks formed a massive geographical spine, dividing the frozen, glacial plains to the west from the heavily cratered, ash-covered valleys stretching to the eastern sea. These elves possessed pale skin, angular facial structures, and thick, intricately braided facial hair. They wore heavy insulating garments, woven from subterranean fibers, and carried thick leather packs filled with raw, extracted minerals. They drove their heavy bronze picks into the sheer cliff faces, cutting wide, horizontal shafts directly through the solid bedrock. They hauled the excavated rock out to the slopes and moved their entire population deep into the subterranean crust. The scribes, carving the chronological clay tablets, label this deeply entrenched elven faction the Dwemer. Inside the dark, subterranean cavities, the Dwemer expanded the natural cave systems into colossal, open caverns. They channeled the volatile liquid magma from the deep planetary mantle into wide, stone-lined trenches to illuminate the darkness and heat their massive industrial forges. They smelted a highly resilient, golden-colored metal alloy from the raw underground ores. They poured the superheated liquid metal into precise sand molds, casting enormous interlocking gears, thick pressure valves, and long, hollow pipes. The Dwemer engineers assembled these metallic components into towering kinetic engines. They drove heavy metal pistons by routing pressurized steam from deep underground boiling aquifers through the copper and brass tubing. The air in these underground cities smelled constantly of sulfur, hot lubricating oil, and scorched metal. The Dwemer focused entirely on the rigorous application of mathematical equations and strict physical observation to manipulate their environment. They harvested bioluminescent fungi from the deep, damp crevices of the crust, grinding the glowing caps in heavy stone mortars. They distilled the caustic fluids over concentrated magma flames, isolating highly reactive alchemical reagents in clear glass vials. To manipulate the heavy stone around them, they struck long, calibrated metallic tuning forks against the cavern walls. They recorded the exact acoustic frequencies, causing the molecular bonds of the granite to vibrate and loosen. By projecting these sustained, specific sound waves, they liquefied solid basalt and reshaped the cavern ceilings into smooth, perfectly symmetrical domes. They achieved massive architectural expansion using localized sonic resonance to mold the bedrock into complex geometric patterns. The subterranean networks stretched for hundreds of miles beneath the jagged mountain range. Deep below the biting frost and the falling volcanic soot of the surface, the Dwemer operated their cities as entirely contained, climate-regulated environments. Spinning brass ventilators pushed the stale, heavy air up through vertical exhaust shafts to the rocky slopes above. Rotating mechanical luminaries containing captured glowing crystals projected bright, steady light across the polished stone pathways. The engineers sealed the entrances to their tunnels with massive, heavily bolted brass doors. They maintained their population exclusively within these protected metallic vaults, immersing themselves in the constant, rhythmic ticking of their clockwork machinery and the continuous hiss of venting steam. High above the churning gears and the spinning ventilators, the migrating columns of the Khymer dragged their wooden carts into the same steep mountain passes. The ash-covered elves established their surface camps directly over the buried Dwemer cities. The Khymer ignited green fires on the rocky slopes, slaughtering the heavy-hided native beasts and spilling the thick blood across black basalt altars. They directed their acoustic chants upward, drawing the volatile, chaotic energy of the Daedric spirits down from the dark outer boundaries of the Albis. The heavy, rhythmic voices of the Khmer and the sharp cracks of the Daedric manifestations filtered down through the porous mountain rock, vibrating the hanging brass fixtures and the delicate glass vials inside the subterranean laboratories. The Dwemer engineers observed the sudden fluctuations in the ambient temperature and measured the erratic acoustic waves penetrating their ceilings. They recorded the volatile energy signatures pooling on the surface directly above their forges. In response to the shifting environmental metrics, the Dwemer forged heavy bipedal automatons. They constructed these tall machines out of polished bronze, filling their internal chambers with superheated steam and powering their central engines with acoustically charged crystalline gems. The engineers directed these heavily armored metallic guardians to the upper levels of the access tunnels. The brass machines stood shoulder to shoulder, directly behind the sealed entryways, their exhaust pipes blowing steady streams of hot vapor into the stone corridors. On the surface, the Khymer scouts tracked the rising columns of steam and the rhythmic, metallic clanging echoing from the deep rock fissures. They walked down the steep inclines and approached the massive brass doors set into the mountainsides. They traced the intricate geometric runes carved into the metal and gripped their curved bronze blades. The physical proximity of the two heavily armed, biologically diverging elven populations within the exact same geological region established a tight, highly pressurized perimeter line. The intersection of the Daedric channeling surface camps and the mechanically driven subterranean vaults initiated the immediate territorial friction required for the coming conflicts under the leadership of the prophet Veloth. Veloth halted his followers near a wide, sloping mountain pass leading directly into the eastern ash plains. The Khymer dropped their wooden packs and began securing their leather tents to the rocky ground. Veloth unrolled a thick animal hide map, tracing the exact lines of the mountain range and marking the locations of the heavy brass doors they had discovered. He recognized the specific architectural style and metallurgical composition of the doors, identifying them as the work of the Dwemer. The presence of the deep subterranean vaults confirmed that the science-minded elves had entirely bypassed the fertile western coasts and tunneled straight into the most geologically hostile region of Tamriel. Veloth instructed his scouts to monitor the steam vents and record the rotation cycles of the mechanical sentries, establishing a rigid surveillance perimeter around the Dwemer entry points. The Khymer immediately set about altering the surface landscape to support their Daedric rituals. They carried heavy basalt boulders from the lower slopes, arranging them into wide, circular altars at the center of their camps. They dug shallow trenches around these altars, filling them with the thick, coagulated blood of the large cliff racers they hunted for food. The Kaima did not utilize the passive, acoustic resonance favored by the Aelids or the Aldma of the islands. Instead, they performed loud, highly physical rituals. They struck heavy bone drums and tore their own skin with jagged obsidian knives, bleeding directly onto the basalt. The sharp pain and sudden biological trauma created severe, localized fluctuations in the ambient magic. These highly concentrated energy spikes served as direct physical tethers, pulling the chaotic, shifting mass of the Daedric princes down from the outer boundaries of oblivion. Veloth focused these rituals specifically on a group of Daedra known as the Good Daedra. These entities, Boethia, Mephala, and Azura, responded to the blood and acoustic vibrations by projecting their physical mass into the center of the camps. They manifested as towering, multi-armed figures composed of dark smoke, spinning webs, and blinding starlight. The sudden presence of these high-heat, highly volatile beings rapidly increased the temperature of the surrounding air, melting the snowpack and boiling the blood in the trenches. The Daedra instructed the Kaima on methods of survival in the harsh, ash-covered environment. They taught the elves how to forge stronger, curved blades out of the volcanic rock, and how to channel raw, chaotic energy to harden their skin against the abrasive wind. The Kaima absorbed this knowledge, integrating the volatile magic directly into their daily physical routines and military tactics. Directly below the blood-soaked altars, the Dwemer engineers continued to expand their brass and steam infrastructure. They routed fresh lines of copper tubing past the ceiling of the uppermost caverns, utilizing large acoustic tuning forks to monitor the structural integrity of the rock above. The loud, rhythmic beating of the bone drums and the sudden, massive thermal spikes from the Daedric manifestations registered clearly on their instruments. The constant acoustic interference threatened to misalign the precise geometric vibrations they used to mold the bedrock. In response, the Dwemer increased the steam pressure in their upper levels, venting thick clouds of superheated vapor directly out of the surface fissures. They deployed additional, heavily armored mechanical spiders to patrol the tunnels just inside the brass doors, outfitting the automatons with high-velocity projectile launchers designed to pierce thick leather armor. The ideological separation between the two groups hardened into a physical boundary line marked by the mountain slopes. The Kima viewed the surface of the world as a harsh, violent testing ground, requiring constant physical sacrifice and the direct intervention of the chaotic spirits to survive. They worshipped the unpredictable power of the void. The Dwemer rejected all external spiritual forces. They viewed the physical universe as a complex, broken machine that could be entirely understood, dismantled, and rebuilt through rigorous mathematical application and mechanical engineering. They trusted only the constant, predictable pressure of steam and the strength of smelted bronze. The proximity of the two populations created immediate, tangible friction. When a Kaima hunting party tracked a wounded beast too close to a brass entryway, a Dwemer mechanical spider would step out of the shadows and fire a heavy metal bolt into the dirt directly in front of their feet. If a Dwemer engineer opened a surface vent to release excess pressure, they would find the opening blocked by stacked basalt and coagulated blood from a recent Kaima ritual. The two factions rarely engaged in open, large-scale combat during this early period. Instead, they engaged in a continuous, grinding territorial dispute, testing the physical limits of their respective technologies and magics against the harsh backdrop of the volcanic mountains. The constant exchange of acoustic drumming, venting steam, and localized magical spikes established a deep, underlying tension that would dictate the physical borders of Resdayn for thousands of years. While the elves carved up the southern and central land masses, the extreme northern coast of Tamriel remained buried under thick glacial ice, waiting for the arrival of an entirely different biological lineage. Across the northern saltwater ocean, a massive continent of exposed bedrock and thick glacial ice spans the horizon. The scribes label this landmass Atmora. Freezing atmospheric currents blow across the jagged ridges, carrying heavy flurries of crystallized snow and sharp ice particles. The ambient temperature drops consistently below the freezing point of water, locking the winding rivers and deep lakes under thick, impenetrable layers of solid blue ice. The biological descendants of the fragmented Elnafey, who occupied this northern region, developed distinct physical traits to endure the severe thermal drop and the biting winds. They grew thick layers of subcutaneous fat and heavy, dense muscle mass across their chests and arms. Their skin turned entirely pale, absorbing the faint solar radiation penetrating the thick, grey cloud cover. They grew dense, coarse hair across their heads and lower jaws, trapping their expelled body heat close to their skin. These beings wrap their broad shoulders in the thick, insulated pelts of the heavy-hided mammals they hunt across the tundra. They strike iron ore against flat granite anvils, using the intense friction to heat and forge heavy, blunt weapons and wide, single-edged axes. The texts refer to these early resilient populations as the Naids, the first tribes of men. They dig deep trenches into the frozen dirt, reinforcing the subterranean walls with packed snow and thick pine logs to block the continuous, howling wind. The men group together around central, roaring fire pits, holding their calloused hands out to the open flames to maintain their core body temperatures. They consume the roasted flesh and suck the high-calorie marrow from the cracked bones of the local fauna, fueling their massive physical frames for the intense manual labor required by their hostile environment. The ice caps at the northernmost pole expand continuously, pushing massive walls of blue ice steadily southward. The creeping glaciers grind down the narrow mountain passes, burying the sparse, fibrous vegetation and driving the massive herd animals toward the southern coastlines. As the habitable landmass shrinks under the advancing frost, the Nedic tribes converge on the remaining stretches of exposed soil. The close physical proximity leads to immediate, violent confrontation over the dwindling resources. Bronze and iron axes strike thick leather armor and solid bone, sending sharp cracks echoing across the valleys. The tribes fracture into warring clans, swinging heavy iron swords and driving splintering wooden spears through the chests of their rivals. They leave heavy trails of dark, thick blood freezing rapidly on the white snow. The constant, grinding combat leaves the ground littered with severed limbs, shattered wooden shields, and crushed skulls. The conflict reduces their population numbers drastically, forcing many tribes to abandon the continent entirely to survive the mounting physical pressures. The fleeing Nedic tribes fell, the remaining towering pine trees, along the southern coasts of Atmora. They strip the rough bark with their hand axes, cut the raw wood into long, overlapping planks, and bind the timber together with heavy iron rivets and thick animal sinew. They construct narrow, deep-hulled longboats, designed specifically to cut through the violent, freezing swells of the open ocean. Hundreds of these wooden vessels push off the rocky shores, their keels scraping loudly against the gravel. Thick-armed men grip heavy wooden oars, pulling in perfect unison to drive the boats across the turbulent water toward the southern landmass of Tamriel. The men synchronize their rowing to the loud, rhythmic beating of heavy animal hide drums mounted at the rear of the ships. The caustic sea spray freezes instantly on their thick beards and the wooden gunwales as they navigate the towering grey waves. The scholars place the peak volume of this massive physical exodus around the 1000th year of the Merethic era, tracking the arrival of the wooden ships on the opposite shores. The Nedic longboats strike the jagged coastlines of Tamriel, the wooden hulls colliding heavily against the submerged rocks. The men leap into the freezing surf, the salt water soaking their fur garments, and drag the heavy vessels onto the gravel beaches of the regions later named High Rock, Hammerfell, and the northern edges of Cyrodiil and Black Marsh. They unload their iron tools, heavy animal pelts, and carved bone totems onto the wet, temperate dirt. They swing their heavy axes to clear the dense underbrush, pulling the thick vines away to create wide, open clearings for their structures. They step into the coastal forests and drive sharpened wooden stakes into the thawing mud to claim the territory. They construct circular dwellings from wet clay, packed earth, and woven river reeds, stacking the materials thickly to insulate the interiors against the damp air. They dig deep fire pits in the center of these settlements, burning the abundant dry timber to generate sustained thermal heat. They hunt the local fauna with their iron-tipped spears, leaving behind scattered piles of cracked bones and discarded ash as they establish their first permanent footholds on the continent. Back on the shrinking, ice-covered shores of Atmora, the physical violence between the remaining clans reaches a critical threshold. The creeping glaciers consume the final patches of grazing land, and the constant, brutal combat leaves the snowfields covered in shattered iron and bleeding bodies. A single, towering tribal leader walks to the edge of the freezing surf, his heavy boots crushing the ice crystals deep into the dark mud. The freezing wind whips his heavy fur cloak around his thick legs as he observes the destruction of his homeland. He turns his broad back on the burning pine timber of a besieged settlement, gathering his 2 sons and a massive host of surviving warriors around the rocky shoreline. He raises his heavy iron axe, pointing the blade at the remaining coastal forests, and directs his followers to fell the trees and construct the largest fleet of longboats the northern continent has ever produced, preparing to launch a coordinated, massive-scale maritime invasion across the freezing ocean. The heavy iron axes bit deep into the trunks of the ancient Atmoran pines. The surviving Nedic warriors, their broad chests heaving under thick fur mantles, worked in massive, coordinated shifts to fell the timber. They dragged the massive logs through the freezing mud to the rocky beaches, utilizing the raw physical strength developed over generations of glacial survival. They split the logs with iron wedges, carving hundreds of thick, overlapping planks. They stoked roaring forge fires directly on the sand, melting down their shattered iron armor and bent swords to cast long, heavy rivets. They drove these glowing rivets through the timber, assembling a fleet of deep-hulled longboats entirely covering the southern coastline of the frozen continent. The towering leader who commanded this construction stood at the center of the beach, his thick, calloused hands resting on the pommel of his massive iron axe. The scribes record his name as Ysgramor. His pale skin bore thick, jagged scars from the continuous clan warfare, and his coarse beard was stiff with frozen sea spray. He directed his 2 sons, Ingol and Ilgar, to load the heaviest cargo onto the flagship. They filled the wooden hulls with crates of dried, salted meat, heavy stone sharpening wheels, and the forged iron totems of their animal gods. They packed the remaining warriors, men and women heavily muscled and clad in layered animal hides, into the narrow benches of the longboats. Ysgramor boarded the lead vessel, gripping the massive wooden tiller, and ordered the fleet to push off the gravel shores. The Atmoran longboats broke through the thick sea ice, their iron-reinforced prows shattering the frozen crust of the northern ocean. The men rowed in unison, the heavy wooden oars pulling against the violent currents. They navigated through towering storms of freezing rain and highly localized squalls of jagged hail, relying entirely on their physical endurance and the structural integrity of the timber to survive the crossing. After weeks of continuous, grueling navigation, the fleet struck the northernmost tip of Tamriel. The sharp, jagged rocks of the peninsula tore deep gashes into the hulls of several ships, spilling men and heavy iron cargo into the freezing surf. Ysgramor drove his flagship onto a narrow strip of gravel beach, the impact sending thick spray over the gunwales. He stepped out of the boat, his heavy boots crushing the frosted sand of Sarek Head, establishing the first recorded mass migration of men onto the northern coast of the continent. Ysgramor's forces pulled the surviving longboats out of the water, utilizing the damaged timber to build temporary shelters against the biting coastal winds. They scouted the immediate terrain, moving southward through dense, snow-covered pine forests and jagged granite ravines. They encountered no towering marble spires and no bronze-clad patrols. The extreme northern latitude, with its heavy snowfall and freezing temperatures, had deterred the golden-skinned elves from establishing any permanent settlements in the region. Ysgramor ordered his men to clear a wide, flat plateau nestled between a high mountain ridge and a freezing river. They drove heavy pine logs deep into the permafrost, constructing a massive, sprawling settlement of thick wooden longhouses and high timber palisades. They named this fortified encampment Sarthal, firmly anchoring their physical presence in the new, frozen land. The Nedes of Sarthal unpacked their iron tools and established deep, roaring fire pits in the center of their longhouses. They brought the physical representations of their religion across the ocean, erecting heavy stone altars carved with the distinct shapes of bears, wolves, and owls. Above all these, they elevated the physical carvings of massive winged reptiles. They designated specific men and women to maintain constant fires before these dragon totems, organizing the earlier structures of the Atmoran dragon cult within the wooden walls of the new city. They hunted the thick-hided beasts of the tundra and dug deep into the frozen dirt to extract raw iron ore, completely ignoring the complex magical properties of the continent in favor of raw, physical survival. As the population of Sarthal expanded, their hunting parties moved further south, descending from the snowy plateaus into the more temperate forested valleys. Here, they made direct physical contact with the established borders of the elven expansion. The Atmoran hunters, clad in heavy bear pelts and carrying blunt iron axes, stood at the edges of the forest clearings. They observed the tall, pale-skinned elves standing before perfectly smooth stone structures, wearing intricate garments of spun fiber and holding sharp, polished bronze spears. The elves, a northern offshoot of the Old Mary migrations, looked back at the heavily muscled, bearded men. The initial physical contact between the two distinct biological lineages did not immediately result in violence. The deep, frozen plains separated the raw timber longhouses of Sarthal from the polished stone settlements of the elves. The vast expanse of unoccupied territory provided enough physical distance to mitigate the immediate territorial friction. The two populations engaged in cautious, limited physical exchanges. The men offered raw iron ore and thick, heavy animal hides. The elves traded woven fibers, polished bronze tools, and small, sealed vials of distilled alchemical fluids. For a measurable span of years, the heavy iron axes of the Neddies and the sharp bronze spears of the elves remained lowered, maintaining a tense, strictly transactional perimeter across the snowy landscape. The tension along the frozen northern borders broke when the Nedic population in Sarthal outgrew their initial wooden palisades. The heavy hunting parties of men pushed further into the surrounding valleys, their thick iron axes clearing wide swathes of the ancient pine forests to make room for new longhouses and expanded fire pits. The noise of falling timber and the thick smoke from their forges drifted over the ridges, reaching the polished stone settlements of the elves. The elves observed the rapid physical expansion of the men and calculated the accelerated drain on the local flora and fauna. They sent a small, heavily armed detachment of spearmen down into the valleys. These elves wore tightly woven fiber armor and carried long bronze spears, marching in strict, synchronized formations to directly confront the Nedic logging camps. The elves demanded a physical halt to the deforestation, pointing their bronze spears at the piled logs and the deep fire pits. The Nedic warriors gripped their iron hand axes and refused to yield the cleared ground. The standoff quickly escalated into close-quarters combat. Heavy iron blades met polished bronze spear tips, the physical friction throwing off bright sparks in the snow. The men utilized their massive upper body strength to shatter the wooden shafts of the spears, driving their heavy axes directly into the fiber armor of the elves. The elves responded with tight, coordinated thrusts, using their superior reach to puncture the thick animal hides of the men. Blood stained the trampled snow, and the bodies of both men and elves fell among the felled pine trunks. The initial skirmish concluded with heavy casualties on both sides, setting a brutal precedent for physical engagement. The skirmishes rapidly intensified into organized military campaigns. The elves mobilized their full standing army, marching across the frozen plains toward Sarthal. They dragged heavy bronze siege engines, equipped with thick, acoustic resonant crystals, positioning them on the ridges directly overlooking the wooden city. They projected concentrated high-frequency sound waves downward, shattering the thick pine logs of the palisades and igniting the thatched roofs of the longhouses. The Nedic defenders rushed the walls, attempting to scale the steep inclines and engage the elves in close-quarters combat. They hurled heavy iron javelins and threw massive, unhewn boulders at the acoustic engines, attempting to physically dismantle the sophisticated weaponry. The elves maintained their strict formations, utilizing their bronze shields to deflect the incoming projectiles while continuously firing the resonant crystals into the heart of the settlement. During the height of the bombardment, the elven acoustic waves struck a deep, subterranean vault located directly beneath the center of Sarthal. The intense vibrations cracked the frozen bedrock, exposing a massive, spherical object buried in the permafrost. The object radiated an intense, blinding blue-white light and pulsed with a heavy, localized gravitational field that distorted the falling snow around it. The texts identify this buried object as the Eye of Magnus, a dense concentration of raw magic left behind during the architect's violent departure from Mundus. The discovery of the eye drastically altered the parameters of the conflict. The elves immediately recognized the immense power of the object and redirected their entire military focus toward capturing it. They intensified their acoustic bombardment, focusing the resonant waves entirely on the structures surrounding the exposed vault. The heavy pine logs splintered and collapsed, burying the Merethic defenders under tons of flaming debris. The elves charged down the ridges, their bronze spears piercing the surviving men as they pushed their way into the center of the city. They slaughtered the inhabitants without hesitation, systematically clearing the area to secure the eye. The brutal, large-scale massacre within the burning walls of the settlement became known as the Night of Tears. The elves successfully secured the massive glowing sphere, wrapping it in thick chains and dragging it out of the crater, leaving Saarthal completely leveled and its population decimated. Ysgramor stood among the burning wreckage of his city, his heavy iron axe slick with the blood of the elven infantry. He observed the overwhelming numbers of the enemy forces and the devastating destructive capabilities of their acoustic weaponry. He recognized the immediate physical impossibility of holding the ground. He grabbed his two sons, Ingol and Ilgar, and forced them away from the fighting. The three men ran through the freezing snow, dodging the incoming bronze arrows and the shattering acoustic blasts. They reached the coastal shoreline, pushing a single, small longboat into the freezing surf. They rowed frantically away from the continent, leaving the burning remains of Saarthal behind as they navigated the dark waters back toward the icy shores of Atmora. They carried the physical memory of the slaughter and the precise location of the elven settlements, preparing to harness the full, brutal strength of the northern continent for a massive, coordinated retaliation. Ysgramor stepped onto the rocky beach of Atmora, dragging the prow of the small, damaged longboat onto the ice. He looked across the dark, freezing waters toward the distant southern horizon. He turned to his sons and the gathered warriors, recounting the physical destruction of Saarthal and the overwhelming numbers of the elven infantry. He raised his heavy iron axe and issued a direct order for total mobilization. He commanded the remaining Merethic clans to cease their internal combat immediately. He directed them to turn their massive industrial forges entirely toward the production of heavy weapons and large-scale maritime transport. The physical response across the northern continent was massive. Thousands of heavily muscled men and women abandoned the inland hunting grounds and flooded the coastal settlements. They dragged massive pine trunks to the shoreline and sparked hundreds of new fire pits on the sand. They melted down every available piece of scrap iron, pouring the liquid metal into sand molds to cast broad, double-edged axes, heavy warhammers, and thick, interlocking rings of chainmail. They wove heavy sails from the coarse fur of the local beasts, reinforcing the fabric with treated animal fat to resist the freezing sea spray. The scribes record this massive unified military force as the 500 Companions, the first organized, continent-wide army of men. Ysgramor organized the fleet into strict physical divisions, assigning specific clan leaders to command groups of 10 longboats. He stood at the head of the armada, his heavy boots planted firmly on the deck of his newly constructed flagship, the Ingol. He gave the signal, and 500 heavy wooden vessels pushed simultaneously off the gravel beaches, their iron-reinforced hulls cutting through the surface ice. Thousands of wooden oars struck the water in unison, driving the massive fleet southward across the turbulent ocean. They completely abandoned the frozen continent of Atmora, leaving the empty longhouses and extinguished fire pits to be consumed by the advancing glaciers. They focused their entire collective physical strength on a singular objective: total territorial reclamation and the systemic eradication of the elven populations in the northern valleys of Tamriel. The crossing proved physically devastating. Massive storm systems, generated by the localized thermal imbalances in the atmosphere, swept across the open ocean. Freezing rain and heavy hail pounded the wooden decks, shattering oars and tearing the heavy fur sails. Towering waves crashed over the gunwales, swamping several longboats, and dragging hundreds of armored warriors down into the freezing depths. During the height of the storm, the fleet was separated. Isgramore's ship, the Ingol, along with the vessel carrying his son of the same name, drifted far to the east, pushed off course by the violent currents. When the storm finally broke, the scattered fleet regrouped off the northern coast of Tamriel. Their numbers reduced, but their physical momentum completely undiminished. The 500 companions drove their remaining ships onto the gravel beaches of Sharik Head. They leaped over the wooden sides, their chainmail clinking heavily against their iron weapons, and charged up the steep, snow-covered inclines. They bypassed the ruined, blackened timbers of Sarthal entirely, moving directly toward the polished stone settlements of the elves. The elven defenders, accustomed to fighting small, disorganized hunting parties, were completely overwhelmed by the sheer mass and coordinated ferocity of the Atmoran army. The men swung their heavy axes, shattering the thin bronze spears and crushing the delicate fiber armor of the elves. They battered down the limestone walls with heavy wooden rams and set fire to the intricate, woven structures inside the settlements. Ysgramor directed the slaughter with methodical precision. He established a strict, rotating front line, allowing fresh, uninjured warriors to continuously replace those exhausted by the heavy physical exertion of close-quarters combat. The elves attempted to utilize their acoustic magic, projecting high-frequency waves to disorient the attackers. The men countered by striking their heavy bone drums simultaneously, generating a massive, overlapping counter-resonance that disrupted the focused acoustic patterns and shattered the delicate tuning crystals of the elves. The Atmoran forces drove the surviving elven populations out of the northern valleys entirely, pushing them southward across the jagged mountain passes and completely securing the frozen northern plains for the Nedic tribes. With the immediate perimeter cleared, Ysgramor ordered his men to construct new, heavy stone fortifications over the ruins of the elven settlements. They stacked the captured limestone blocks, reinforcing the walls with thick iron beams and packed permafrost. They built massive central longhouses to house the surviving clan leaders and established deep, continuous fire pits to combat the freezing temperatures. They spread their hunting parties across the wide plains, tracking the massive, thick-hided beasts and establishing a permanent, heavily armed physical presence across the entire northern region of the continent. The scribes trace the establishment of these early, fortified stone cities as the physical foundation of the Kingdom of Skyrim, marking the definitive end of elven territorial dominance in the north. The elves stationed in the central valleys gathered around the deep crater left by the extracted Eye of Magnus. They examined the scorched dirt and the shattered remains of the heavy Atmoran siege engines. They recognized the brutal physical strength of the northern men and the vulnerability of their own highly structured, fiber-armored ranks. To prevent another massive coastal invasion, these elves, later called the Falmer or Snow Elves, retreated deep into the subterranean caverns of the jagged mountain range. They located the thick, brass-sealed entryways of the Dwemer cities and utilized focused acoustic waves to vibrate the locking mechanisms, requesting physical asylum from the harsh surface weather and the heavy iron axes of the Neddies. The Dwemer engineers unbolted the heavy metal doors, stepping aside to observe the pale-skinned refugees shivering in their torn garments. The Dwemer did not engage in immediate violence. Instead, they required the Snow Elves to consume a specific, highly refined alchemical fluid before granting them permanent access to the deeper, heated caverns. The Falmer drank the glowing, caustic liquid from thick glass vials. The fluid triggered an immediate, severe cellular breakdown within their bodies. Their pale skin withered and turned a sickly, translucent grey. The fluid targeted their optic nerves, clouding their eyes with thick cataracts and completely blinding the entire population. The Dwemer utilized the blind, disoriented elves as heavy manual labor, chaining them to the massive spinning gears and forcing them to haul carts of raw ore through the pitch-black lower tunnels. While the Dwemer consolidated their subterranean labor force, the Aelids in the central jungles of Cyrodiil expanded their own slaving operations. The heavy limestone walls of the Aelid cities completely surrounded the fertile river valleys, creating an impenetrable physical perimeter. The Aelid infantry, wearing polished bronze breastplates and carrying sharp spears, marched outward from the gates, systematically capturing the native Nedic tribes who had migrated south from the frozen plains. The elves bound the men and women with heavy iron collars, dragging them back into the subterranean vaults beneath the white marble plazas. The Aelids focused entirely on extracting raw biological energy from their captives. They strapped the Nedic slaves to altars of meteoric iron, utilizing sharp obsidian blades to carve precise geometric runes directly into their flesh. They channeled the resulting massive kinetic pain and thermal spikes into the central crystals, powering their floating architectural structures and heating their massive public baths. The physical suffering generated by the Aelid rituals attracted the direct attention of the Daedric princes. The dark, volatile spirits manifested within the lower levels of the subterranean vaults, drawn by the thick pools of blood and the constant, rhythmic acoustic screams of the tortured slaves. The Aelid leaders struck direct physical bargains with the Daedra, trading massive quantities of extracted life force for access to unfiltered chaotic magic. The elves utilized this volatile energy to rapidly mutate the surrounding jungle flora into highly aggressive, carnivorous thickets. They forged massive, animate statues out of packed limestone and boiling magma, deploying the heavy constructs to crush any attempted uprisings within the slave pens. The Aelid city-states, fueled by constant blood sacrifices and dark magical pacts, grew into towering, impenetrable fortresses of white stone and green fire. In the eastern ash plains, the Chimer watched the sky as a heavy, mechanical object broke through the cloud cover. A massive brass-plated Dwemer airship, powered by synchronized acoustic crystals and roaring steam engines, drifted over the black basalt altars of a Chimer encampment. The airship dropped heavy bronze projectiles onto the tents below, the impact shattering the packed dirt and scattering the heavy animal hides. The Chimer retaliated by launching concentrated blasts of dark, volatile magic upward, melting the exposed copper tubing and forcing the heavy vessel to crash violently into the jagged rocks. The long-standing territorial friction between the two distinct elven factions finally erupted into open, large-scale physical combat across the volcanic region. The Dwemer deployed massive columns of heavy brass automatons from the mountain tunnels, the metallic spiders and towering centurions marching across the grey ash. The Chimer met them with curved obsidian blades and heavy bone shields, their skin hardened by Daedric rituals. The metal constructs fired high-velocity bolts that pierced the thick leather armor of the Chimer, while the elves drove their blades into the exposed steam joints and fragile glass housing the acoustic crystals. The brutal, mechanical warfare tore up the landscape, mixing the spilled blood of the Chimer with the thick, black lubricating oil of the shattered machines. The constant, grinding combat across the harsh terrain established a localized, highly volatile physical perimeter that completely consumed the focus of both populations, ensuring neither faction noticed the massive, unified army of men massing on the northern borders. The heavy stone fortifications of the Nedders now spanned the entire northern perimeter of Tamriel. The Atmoran warriors dug deep iron mines into the permafrost, constantly forging new weapons and thick chainmail to equip their expanding population. They completely dominated the surface geology of Skyrim, their heavy boots packing the snow into wide, permanent roads connecting their fortified settlements. However, a specific biological offshoot of the Aldmer remained physically entrenched beneath the Nedic watchtowers. The deep subterranean caverns occupied by the Dwemer and their blinded Falmer slaves continued to expand, entirely undetected by the men on the surface. The heavy, pressurized steam venting from the Dwemer exhaust shafts mixed seamlessly with the thick grey smoke billowing from the Atmoran iron forges, masking the massive mechanical infrastructure operating deep within the bedrock. Within the lowest, most heavily insulated vaults of these subterranean cities, the Dwemer engineers cultivated large crops of glowing, bioluminescent fungi. They harvested the toxic spores, feeding them directly to the chained Falmer. The continuous ingestion of this specific alchemical diet induced further, extreme biological mutations. The remaining traces of the Falmer's golden skin completely stripped away, leaving them entirely pigmentless. Their spines curved permanently, forcing them into a hunched quadrupedal stance, and their auditory receptors grew massive, compensating for their total lack of sight. The Dwemer utilized these severely mutated beings to navigate the pitch-black, narrowest fissures of the tectonic plates, extracting heavy raw ores from locations entirely inaccessible to the armored brass automatons. The chimer on the eastern surface continued to strike the black basalt altars with heavy obsidian knives, funneling the volatile energy of the Daedra downward into the mountain rocks. The constant thermal spikes and acoustic shocks finally destabilized the fault lines directly above the largest Dwemer city, Bethuand. The heavy granite ceiling of the upper cavern fractured, dropping thousands of tons of raw stone directly onto the spinning brass gears and pressurized steam lines. The resulting mechanical explosion tore a massive hole through the side of the mountain, exposing the subterranean architecture to the harsh, ash-filled air. The Chimer scouts immediately entered the breach, their curved blades cutting through the damaged automatons and initiating a direct, physical invasion of the Dwemer stronghold. The invasion forced the Dwemer to completely reallocate their mechanical resources. They shut down the deep mining operations, recalling the heavily armored Centurions to defend the upper access tunnels against the Chimer infantry. The sudden absence of the massive brass guards in the lower caverns removed the primary physical barrier containing the mutated Falmer. The blind, hunched slaves, relying entirely on their highly developed acoustic senses, detected the cessation of the heavy, rhythmic mechanical footsteps. They broke their iron chains by striking them against the sharp, jagged edges of the unhewn rock, organizing into massive feral swarms in the pitch-black tunnels. The Falmer turned their crude mining picks and sharpened bone fragments against the isolated Dwemer engineers, launching a brutal, subterranean rebellion. The Dwemer found themselves entirely caught between two massive physical assaults. The Chimer pushed downward from the surface, utilizing highly volatile Daedric magic to melt the brass doors and boil the steam lines. The Falmer surged upward from the deep trenches, relying on their sheer numbers and physical ferocity to overwhelm the engineers in the dark corridors. To prevent the total collapse of their mechanical infrastructure, the Dwemer initiated a highly concentrated, localized acoustic protocol. They struck the massive, central tuning forks located in the core of their cities, projecting a continuous, paralyzing sound wave that targeted the specific biological frequencies of both the Chimer and the Falmer. The intense acoustic vibration dropped the Chimer warriors to their knees, blood pouring from their ears as the sound ruptured their internal organs. The Falmer, possessing massive, hypersensitive auditory receptors, suffered catastrophic physical damage. Their skulls cracked under the immense sonic pressure, the vibration shattering their brittle bones and liquefying their cellular structures. The Dwemer engineers, wearing thick, sound-dampening brass helmets, marched through the paralyzed masses, utilizing heavy metal hammers to physically crush the remaining attackers. The successful acoustic defense temporarily stabilized the borders of the subterranean cities, but the sheer physical devastation left the Dwemer population severely depleted and their mechanical infrastructure critically damaged. The constant, grinding warfare across the eastern mountains had consumed the physical resources of both elven populations, locking them into a perpetual state of conflict. The heavy ash from the Red Mountain continued to bury the Chimer surface camps, while the highly toxic fungi cultivated by the Dwemer poisoned the deep underground aquifers. As the Merethic era progressed, the physical toll of this localized friction drained the strength of the elves, entirely removing their focus from the rapidly expanding Nedic forces to the west. The Aelids in Cyrodiil remained isolated behind their high limestone walls, entirely consumed by their bloody rituals and dark magical pacts. The distinct, biologically divided elven factions had fractured the unified power of the Aldmeri ancestors, leaving the sprawling continent of Tamriel open and vulnerable to the continued physical expansion of men. The consolidation of the northern plains under the Nedic clans established a rigid, fortified border across the upper latitudes of Tamriel. The remaining elven populations, the Falmer, were entirely contained within the subterranean tunnels or pushed into isolated, high-altitude mountain redoubts. The men of Skyrim, fueled by the captured geothermal vents and the continuous output of their iron forges, turned their focus southward. They expanded their timber and stone settlements down the central river valleys, their heavy supply carts rolling over the crushed limestone blocks of the former elven outposts. The constant physical expansion required massive amounts of raw materials, driving the Nedic logging camps deep into the dense, broadleaf forests bordering the Aeliad territories in Cyrodiil. The Aelids detected the systematic clearing of the northern forests. They observed the heavy iron axes of the men cutting through the ancient timber, identifying the direct physical threat to their own expanding city-states. The Aelids responded by increasing the frequency and scale of their blood rituals. They dragged thousands of their Nedic slaves from the subterranean pens, chaining them to the open-air altars located in the center of their marble plazas. They utilized sharp obsidian blades to inflict massive physical trauma, channeling the resulting spikes of volatile biological energy directly into the surrounding jungle flora. The thick vegetation mutated rapidly, the vines hardening into spiked tendrils and the broad leaves developing acidic sap. The Aelids deployed these animate, carnivorous thickets along their northern borders, creating a dense, highly aggressive biological barrier against the encroaching Atmoran logging camps. The localized friction along the Cyrodiilic border intensified, but the Aelids remained fundamentally isolated from the broader elven populations. The Aldmer on the Somerset Isles observed the rapid Nedic expansion across the northern continent, tracking the heavy columns of black smoke rising from the Atmoran iron forges. The High King of Alinor dispatched fleets of heavy bronze ships to the western coasts of Tamriel, seeking to establish fortified naval bases and secure the sea routes against potential Nedic incursions. These western elves, later identified as the Direni, constructed massive towering keeps out of polished white stone, anchoring their settlements on the rocky islands and steep coastal cliffs of High Rock. They utilized focused acoustic magic to manipulate the ocean currents, creating treacherous whirlpools and sharp, hidden reefs to block the flat-bottomed Nedic longboats from landing on their shores. Simultaneously, a distinct biological offshoot of the Aldmer pushed deep into the thick, humid jungles of the southwest. These elves, known as the Bosmer, completely rejected the heavy masonry and metallurgical practices of their coastal kin. They adapted their physical forms to the dense forest environment, their bodies growing leaner and their skin adopting the mottled green and brown hues of the surrounding foliage. They forged a strict physical pact with the localized forest spirits, pledging to never cut or consume the native timber. In exchange, the spirits granted them the ability to physically manipulate the massive, migratory trees of Valenwood. The Bosmer shaped their settlements directly into the living branches of these walking trees, utilizing the natural mobility of the forest to completely evade the heavy, static iron armies of the expanding Nedic tribes. The rapid geographical division of the elven populations across Tamriel fractured their initial cultural and military unity. The Aelids in the center, the Direni in the west, the Bosmer in the south, and the warring Chimer and Dwemer in the east, all operated as distinct, physically isolated factions. They adapted their survival tactics entirely to their specific environments, developing highly specialized magics and localized defensive perimeters. This fragmentation prevented the elves from mounting a coordinated, continent-wide response to the steady, methodical advance of the men. The Nedic clans in Skyrim continued to mass their physical forces, smelting tons of iron ore and breeding heavy, thick-hided mounts for their cavalry. They established strict hierarchical military structures within their stone longhouses, preparing to drive their heavy axes into the dense jungles of Cyrodiil and the rocky coasts of High Rock. The heavy, grinding combat of the late Merethic era was set entirely by these converging physical borders. The era of unchecked elven expansion concluded, replaced by a brutal, prolonged period of territorial warfare, as the highly adaptable, iron-wielding tribes of men tested the magical defenses of the entrenched elven city-states. The massive physical push by the Nedic clans into the central river valleys forced the Aeliad city-states to re-evaluate their isolated defensive perimeters. The heavy columns of Atmoran infantry, marching entirely on foot and wielding broad iron axes, systematically dismantled the dense biological barriers the Aelids had cultivated. The men swung their heavy blades to sever the thick, spiked vines and drove their iron-shod boots into the acidic sap, completely clearing the overgrown jungle paths. They constructed deep, wide trenches directly outside the limestone walls of the Aeliad settlements, filling the ditches with raw pine pitch and igniting massive, sustained fires to superheat the stone foundations. To counter this direct physical siege, the Aelids consolidated their divided magical resources. The leaders of the individual city-states met in the central plaza of the White Gold Tower, the towering structure they had built over the intersection of the primary ley lines. They pooled their captured meteoric iron crystals, aligning the geometric facets to focus a single, massive beam of concentrated thermal energy. They directed this beam upward, striking the dark, heavy clouds over Cyrodiil and causing the suspended water vapor to rapidly condense and freeze. The Aelids dropped thousands of jagged, heavy ice shards directly onto the Nedic trenches, extinguishing the pine pitch fires and impaling the thick-muscled warriors manning the siege lines. The immediate physical devastation temporarily halted the Nedic advance, providing the Aelids with enough time to construct larger, animate stone constructs. They bound the captured spirits of the fallen Atmoran warriors into heavy marble statues, forcing the dense stone figures to march out of the gates and engage the remaining infantry in brutal, close-quarters combat. The heavy stone fists of the constructs shattered the iron shields of the men, while the Nedic axes simply chipped the thick limestone plating without inflicting structural damage. The combined application of concentrated thermal magic and heavy, animate masonry established a rigid, highly lethal perimeter around the Aelid capital, locking the two massive armies into a prolonged, grinding stalemate along the muddy riverbanks. While the men and the Aelids engaged in heavy, static trench warfare in the center of the continent, the Chimera and the Dwemer completely exhausted their localized resources in the east. The continuous Daedric rituals of the Chimera required massive quantities of raw biological matter, forcing their hunting parties to deplete the local fauna entirely. The Dwemer mechanical infrastructure required a constant, uninterrupted supply of fresh water to generate pressurized steam. The heavy volcanic ash from the Red Mountain clogged their intake valves and poisoned the underground aquifers, bringing their towering brass engines to a grinding halt. The sheer physical degradation of the environment forced the leaders of both factions to cease their direct combat and establish a tense, negotiated physical border across the region. The Chimera leader, Veloth, met with the chief Dwemer engineer, Dumak, on a flat expanse of cooled basalt directly beneath the smoking cone of the volcano. The two elves did not carry their weapons. Veloth's skin bore thick, dark scars from the heavy projectile fire of the automatons, and Dumak's hands were heavily calloused and burned from the superheated brass. They did not exchange acoustic pleasantries or rely on complex magical translations. They utilized sharp obsidian fragments to physically carve a strict, straight line across the flat stone, dividing the surface territory and the subterranean mineral deposits equally between the two populations. They established strict, physical checkpoints along the mountain passes, requiring any crossing elves to completely disarm and submit to rigorous biological and mechanical inspections. This highly regulated, strictly enforced physical boundary officially established the unified territory of Resdain, temporarily halting the localized destruction of the eastern continent. The Direni in High Rock observed the consolidation of the eastern borders and the static trench warfare in Cyrodiil. They tracked the shifting military logistics, noting the massive drain on the Nedic iron supplies and the heavy reliance on imported timber. The Direni utilized their focused acoustic magic to further manipulate the western ocean currents, creating a wide, fast-moving thermal channel that melted the remaining coastal ice. They launched their heavy bronze ships into this channel, sailing rapidly southward along the coast to completely bypass the Nedic blockades. They landed their forces on the sandy beaches of the southern peninsula, avoiding the thick jungle canopy entirely and establishing heavily fortified naval bases along the open coastline. The continuous physical adaptation and the relentless territorial expansion of these distinct populations heavily fragmented the geographical layout of Tamriel. The continent no longer consisted of a single, unified landmass dominated by a singular biological lineage. The heavy iron forges of the men pumped thick smoke into the northern sky, while the bright thermal beams of the Aelids illuminated the central jungles. The towering brass exhaust pipes of the Dwemer hissed against the deep, guttural chants of the Kimmer in the east, and the heavy bronze ships of the Direni patrolled the western shores. The Merethic era, defined by the rapid physical spread and subsequent violent collision of these diverse populations, was rapidly drawing to a close, replaced entirely by the strict, recorded chronological sequence of the First Era. The heavy iron machinery of the Nedis ground forward across the continent, systematically pushing against the established elven perimeters. The men from Skyrim marched south out of the freezing mountains, their thick boots packing the soil into wide, flat roads, connecting their newly established stone fortresses. They dragged heavy carts filled with raw iron ore and forged weaponry, establishing permanent supply lines that allowed their infantry to remain deployed year-round. This continuous physical presence forced the Aelids to construct higher limestone walls and deepen the burning trenches surrounding their jungle city-states. The constant requirement for fresh blood to fuel their defensive botanical barriers pushed the Aeliid slaving parties further outward, directly intercepting the advancing Nedic columns. When the heavy Atmoran infantry encountered the Aeliid raiding parties, the physical disparity dictated the combat. The broad-shouldered men swung heavy iron axes and two-handed warhammers, physically crushing the lightweight bronze armor of the elves. The Aelids responded by channeling concentrated thermal beams from their starlight crystals, flash-boiling the blood of the frontline warriors and dropping them to the mud. The elves dragged the survivors back to the white marble plazas of Cyrodiil, immediately shackling them to the meteoric iron altars. The sheer volume of captured men provided the Aelids with a massive influx of raw biological energy, allowing them to expand their animate stone constructs and reinforce the thick, acidic vines surrounding their cities. This brutal cycle of capture, sacrifice, and magical fortification established a heavy, static border between the two populations, locking the central river valleys in continuous, grinding warfare. To the east, the negotiated border of Resdain held steady under the strict physical enforcement of the Chimera and Dwemer patrols. The Chimera remained on the surface, their skin permanently darkened by the falling volcanic ash from the Red Mountain. They organized into massive, nomadic camps, tracking the herd animals across the plains and relying entirely on the volatile magic of the Daedric princes to survive the harsh temperatures. The Dwemer remained sealed within their subterranean brass cities, the heavy steam engines thumping rhythmically beneath the bedrock. They directed their blind Falmer slaves to extract new, highly conductive minerals from the deep tectonic fissures, utilizing the raw materials to upgrade the high-velocity projectile launchers on their mechanical sentries. The mountain passes remained heavily guarded, the two biologically distinct elven factions observing each other across the deep geological trenches without initiating direct combat. In the western regions, the Direni expanded their naval operations. They constructed massive, multi-tiered galleons from the thick coastal timber, outfitting the ships with long banks of heavy wooden oars and sharp bronze rams. They sailed these heavy vessels up the wide river systems, penetrating deep into the interior of high rock. They utilized focused acoustic frequencies to shatter the crude stone settlements of the native Nedic tribes, physically driving the human populations off the fertile riverbanks. The Direni constructed towering white stone keeps directly over the ruined Nedic fire pits, establishing a rigid feudal hierarchy. They did not slaughter the surviving men. Instead, they forced the human population to cultivate the soil and harvest the crops, utilizing them as a strictly controlled agricultural labor force. The physical proximity of the two lineages in the West resulted in slow, localized biological mixing, fundamentally altering the physical traits of the human populations bound to the Direni estates. The sprawling continent of Tamriel now completely reflected the extreme biological and technological divergence of its inhabitants. The heavy iron tools and thick fur garments of the Nedis dominated the frozen northern plains. The pale, luminous stone and concentrated thermal beams of the Aileids controlled the dense central jungles. The hissing brass steam vents of the Dwemer and the black basalt altars of the Chimer divided the volcanic east, while the towering keeps and heavy bronze ships of the Direni locked down the western coasts. The physical laws engraved in the adamantine tower held the planetary structure stable, while the biological entities on the surface continuously ground against one another, their constant warfare writing the physical record of the first chronological era directly into the dirt and blood of the continent.